Okay, Nora, should we start?
Please, let's go ahead. I think.
Yeah. Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you. Thank you all for joining us today as we explore the various ways in which the Arab uprisings altered the Middle East and North Africa, but also brought to fore the kind of historical roots of mass mobilization and protests across the MENA throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. We're really excited to have an incredible group of people, of experts on the Middle East and North Africa who will be here with us for a good part of this morning to shed light on both the different ways in which the uprisings have altered the region and some of the outcomes and the ways in which we think about them a decade on. But before we start, I really want to extend my gratitude to my colleagues here at BU and at CURA, the Institute for Culture, Religion, and World Affairs, particularly Timothy Longman, who so enthusiastically agreed about hosting this through CURA. But also Arlene Brennan and Kelly Bongiovanni, who rightly are not here with us this morning, but their assistance has really kind of enabled us to pull all of the logistics together. And of course, my colleague, Nora Laurie, and in many ways, my co-conspirator, who really graciously agreed to moderate and join in on the discussion almost on a whim. And I also owe a great debt of gratitude to all the participants for being here with us on a Saturday morning and on Easter weekend, which totally slipped my mind, but I'm so glad everyone was able to make it. And so without further ado, I'll let Noura introduce our panelists, and specifically, we'll go into the first panel. We'll save the Q&A towards the end of each panel. I think we'll field questions. We'll kind of collect questions towards the end of each panel, and we'll field them to the participants. And we'll kind of go into the discussion there. So I ask everyone to please hold off on questions and discussions until all the panelists for each panel have gone through their presentations. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you. Welcome and thank you for joining us. I see lots of names of students and some faculty. So thank you so much for being here on a Saturday morning. We have set this up as a meeting instead of a webinar, precisely so we can hear from you. So please feel free to turn on your videos to engage. And even though we won't reach the questions until everyone has completed presenting, please feel free to use the chat box to pose any questions. Our esteemed panelists need no introduction, but nonetheless, I'm really honored and delighted to be here with a very exciting group of two panels. So I'll start with our first panel. Professor Melanie Cammett is Clarence Dillon Professor of International Affairs in the Department of Government and Chair of the Harvard Academy for International and Area Studies at Harvard University. She specializes in the politics of development, identity politics in the Middle East, and teaches a range of graduate classes and undergraduate classes, and has a whole army of people that she's trained in this field. So we're really honored to have her here. And of course, all of these bios are quite truncated. Next, it's an honor and a delight to have Professor Gregory Gause III, who is the John Lindsay Chair and Professor of International Affairs and Head of the International Affairs Department at the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. Dr. Gause has focused his research on the international politics of the Middle East with a particular interest in the Arabian Peninsula of the Persian Gulf. So thank you, welcome, Greg. And then Professor Valentine Mogaddam is a professor of sociology and international affairs at Northeastern University. Her research areas are in globalization, revolutions and social movements, transnational feminist networks, and gender development, democratization in the Middle East and North Africa. And I know that she and Professor Mako have recently published a book together, so congratulations on that work. I should mention all of our esteemed panelists have published many books in this region, so we're very excited to have them. Professor Bassa Selloukh is an associate professor of political science at Lebanese American University. His main fields of specialization include comparative politics, the global south and especially the Middle East, political theory, public philosophy and philosophy of reconciliation and interculturalism, and international relations, specifically of the Middle East. His current research interests include an intersectional critique of power sharing arrangements in post-war states, the Philosophy of Reconciliation in Divided Places, and the Middle East International Relations After the Popular Uprising. So welcome, Basa. Thank you for being here. And finally, Professor Shemran Mako is an assistant professor of international relations at the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. She's also a member of the graduate faculty in political science at Boston University, and her research and teaching focus on the international relations of the Middle East with a substantive emphasis on foreign intervention, ethnic conflict, political violence in divided societies, and institutions and state building. So thank you all for being here. We're going to start with the first panel, but just to inform everyone, we will have a second panel with Professor Stacy Filbert-Yadav, Professor Bassam Haddad, Professor Elizabeth Nugent, and Professor Francesco Cavorta. So without further ado, I'll turn the floor to Professor Kamet to get us started. Thank you for being here.
Great, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really delighted to be here, even on Zoom, and to be among this fantastic group of colleagues. Forgive me if you hear a dog barking. He's decided this is the moment to start barking. This is the risk of these pandemic webinars. So I'm gonna share my screen briefly to show a few slides. So let me just open that up. And okay. Great. So I was tasked with speaking about socioeconomic trends pre and post uprisings. So I'm just going to sort of present a broad brush picture of the region, not really focusing on a particular country per se. And I think the outlines of the story that I'm telling are incredibly familiar to many of us already, but I want to sort of bring it forward to talk about how things have changed or not changed, and some thoughts about where things are going forward. So first, let me say something that I'm sure is well known to everyone, that in the aftermath of independence, roughly in the 50s, 60s onward, this is a region that experienced major socioeconomic gains, and in the first few decades in particular. And the reason I put this figure up, which shows declining infant mortality levels across the globe, is to show you that the line that represents the Middle East and North Africa, which is the black line, declined really precipitously. If you look in sort of cross-regional comparative perspective, you can see that that is the steepest decline of all global regions. And that's just one indicator, but an important one that captures a lot about social outcomes and socioeconomic well-being. And another reason why I raise this is because this arguably created expectations and rising aspirations for people across the region. And this access to basic services and stable employment, that's sort of part of this larger package of socioeconomic gains, was extremely important in providing a sense of economic security, and enabling generations to enjoy some social mobility. So that's a really important factor there, not just because of the tangible gains, but also because of the expectations that sets in motion. So what was happening in the decades prior, in the decade or two prior to the uprisings? And if you look at the reports by international financial institutions and many economists, the picture looked good from a macroeconomic perspective in general. The story is that there were steady growth rates, higher growth rates than in many regions. And there seems to be a lot of evidence that by different measures of absolute poverty, the Middle East looked better than a lot of regions. So, at this sort of broad brush macroeconomic level, economists had this image of the Middle East as doing well. We know that that's a problematic picture now. I think that's been well exposed. The last thing I want to say is about inequality. A lot of economists have made the argument that the available data suggests that the Middle East was not an especially unequal region, and inequality comes up a lot in discussions of the causes of the Arab uprisings. This I think is a really interesting debate that's playing out right now, because there's a number of economists who are looking at new data sources and suggesting that because these measures that are used to construct measures of inequality don't capture the super rich in their measures of consumption and assets that we may very well have underestimated inequality. But this is still a debate that's out there, and I think one that's interesting to follow. Regardless of what absolute inequality looked like, it's clear that people perceived that inequality was rising. There's no question about that. So what was happening, to continue the story of what was going on? This slide here is a way of capturing a picture of how the state rolled back in the Middle East in the decades from independence. So you can see, if you look at the bottom axis there, starting at 1960, and this is a measure of what is called government consumption, which broadly measures the provision of government services, and also that includes expenditures on public sector employees. So that's very important to keep in mind. So you can see that there was rising Middle Eastern government consumption, investment in the state and state expenditures, and then it comes down. And this is, compared to other low and middle income countries. So it shot up in the 70s. Obviously, this has something to do with rising oil prices, and then fell pretty precipitously in the 1980s. And so what's the effect of this? One thing that's really important to keep in mind is it's not like private investment rose to make up for that shortfall. So this really is an important change that disproportionately affected the poor and the middle classes, especially damaging to poor people who rely on government services. Subsidies to agriculture were cut, so poor people in the rural sector were really damaged. And also, we know, those of us who study the Middle East, that public employment was probably the most important source of welfare, so to speak, and redistribution. And this was cut in very important ways. And just to give you a picture of what this looks like cross-regionally, this is on the far left, you see Middle East, North Africa in 1975, and then 2005. That's the same measure of government consumption. So what are we looking at here? We're looking at the Middle East above everybody, every region in 75, and then going down by 2005. But look at the trends in all the other global regions. They're lower to start, but they rise. So this is a really important change that, I can't emphasize enough how much this matters, given the importance of public spending for well-being for the poor and for public employment, for the labor market, basically. So, we also know very well here that this was happening also in the context of rising state repression. So this figure is taken from that Singranelli and Richards human rights data set. And on the left-hand side, you have that empowerment index, which measures political liberties. And those were declining over time from the 80s to the eve of the uprisings. And on the right-hand side, you have what they call the physical integrity index, which basically measures things like torture and extrajudicial killings and imprisonment and disappearances. So the nasty stuff that governments do. And so if you have a higher score on that, you have more physical integrity, that is less torture. And so that was, declining as well. So that was, represents increasing state repression. And we all know the story of crony capitalism. There's been a lot of super interesting work recently by economists and others really documenting the incidence of crony capitalism across the region, and also looking at its costs in pretty systematic ways. And a number of people have been writing about this for decades. I mean, on this panel, Bassam Haddad, for example, wrote about this a long time ago in the case of Syria, and many others have written about this. And crony capitalism matters for at least two reasons. One is that it seems to have contributed to economic underperformance, because what happens with cronyism, for the most part, it seems that people that were well connected got access to opportunities, but they weren't necessarily the most efficient producers and and their firms did not generate the most jobs. So what you're doing is you're funneling resources to less productive sources. And it also was quite apparent. I mean, people were not stupid in the region. They saw this happening. We know this. And so what does this do? It signals to people that authoritarians are relying on a narrower set of people that are close to them, squeezing out others, and we're less and less concerned about, redistribution of any kind. So this contributes to a sense of perceived inequality that's growing. And so what we have is a changing pattern of state-society relations, where the state is both actually and rhetorically less committed to people and narrowing its social foundations and increasing repression. So this is a recipe for disaster and discontent. And then I just want to say a few more things. I know I only have a few minutes left, but one thing I want to say, based on work that I did with Ishat Diwan and Irina Vartanova, is that we have this trend towards that has implications for people's commitment to democracy, people's trust in government. So let me just explain what's going on here. Basically, I've told you this story that's well known about what was leading up to the uprisings, the state of affairs in regional political economies. And, it's important to recap that story, because arguably the problems have not changed, and if anything have gotten worse in most places. And this also has implications for political transitions, because at the mass level, what we do here is look at shifting levels of perceived economic security. That's one of the things we're doing in this paper. And over time, you have this trend after the uprisings towards an increasing sense of economic insecurity. So, initially people were very excited about transitions, out on the street, mobilizing. But when this goes on for a long enough time, and governments start to crack down, and people are not experiencing tangible change, and there's constant turmoil and so forth, people start to feel less and less economically secure. And then they start to think, was this all worth it? And so what we do here is we trace the relationship between shifting macroeconomic conditions and perceived conditions, and also individual level perceptions and political values over time. And we see, as I've already articulated, that as people are feeling less and less insecure personally, and also about their perceptions of the macroeconomy, they become less committed to democracy, and they have reduced trust in government. And we trace this out in a number of countries. You can see it very clearly, for example, in Tunisia. And so let me just wrap up with a few thoughts about post-uprising trends. And I think this is still a story that needs to be written. People are writing about it now. I'm working on this now with Ishat Diwan and Stephen Heidemann. And so generally speaking, if we want to paint a broad picture, all indicators are deteriorating across the region. And this is even if we're excluding the effects of the pandemic. So let's leave that aside, which has been catastrophic for so many economies. We see across the board lower economic growth. This is documented. This is showing up in the data. We see that macroeconomic imbalances are increasing, like the public debt and deficits and so forth. Obviously governance indicators have not improved in many places. Poverty seems to be on the rise. We've been collecting with some research assistants some data on this, and it looks like that's what the trend is, but I don't think you need to look at the data to know that's happening. And then in addition to that, we have major protracted refugee crises as a result of the conflicts that have been raging in places like Syria and Iraq, not to mention the absolutely catastrophic situation in Yemen. I'm sure Stacey Filbert-Yadav will talk about that. She's one of the world's reigning experts on this. So this is really a disastrous situation. And in crude terms, we can divide up the region, I think, into at least 3 different types of situations here, or scenarios. One is the higher GDP per capita countries in the Gulf, which themselves can be divided, because arguably what goes on in Saudi is quite different from what's going on in, say, the Emirates or Qatar or Kuwait, for example, with smaller citizen populations. And those countries are facing challenges as well. I mean, since 2014, there's been a drop in global oil prices, and these economies, for the most part, are highly dependent on oil. So it's very much a question of how these resources get managed going forward. Then we have what we might call the developing countries of the Middle East that are not particularly oil rich, but they're not completely war torn and destroyed. And I pulled this figure to the right out of a 2018 World Bank report, which looks at pre and post Arab uprising trends in GDP growth and GDP per capita growth for this set of countries. And you can see quite clearly that things have been declining. And this is only through 2014, but the trend continues. And then we have this third set of countries that we might call the war-torn conflict countries I've already alluded to, Libya, Yemen, Syria, Iraq, and these countries are facing just like unimaginable situations. I mean, if you look at the case of Syria, it's quite astounding what has happened to this economy, to this polity, to this society. The numbers are just astounding, but the human stories are so painful in terms of levels of displacement. Not to mention, I mean, of course, death and destruction, but the implications going forward are quite profound. I mean, a number of international organizations have come out with reports about the lost generation of children that have not been educated, the destruction, often purposive destruction of health infrastructure during the war that makes it so impossible to meet the basic needs of the population. So we have very different trends developing in these different kinds of political economies across the region. And I think we need to think of them in different ways. And so going forward, the prospects are not fabulous in any of these scenarios, but obviously in terms of well-being, we have very marked differences and experiences in those higher income countries than in the war-torn countries. And ironically, they are often quite interconnected because of all these geopolitics and regional politics of intervention in regional wars and so forth. So countries in the region are intervening in each other and helping to exacerbate the conflicts and perpetuate them. So I will stop there, and I look forward to hearing the comments of my co-panelists.
Thank you. That was a whirlwind. I was trying to take all the notes, but I'm really glad that we've recorded this session. Professor Gause, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. I'm afraid I'm not going to make people feel any better. I think that from an international relations point of view, the biggest effect of the Arab uprisings of 2011 was the collapse and the in other places, the challenge, the absolutely enormous challenge to state authority. And that creates political vacuums that leads to, I think, distinctive international relations outcomes. Now, the Arab uprisings didn't create this phenomenon in the Middle East. The United States invasion of Iraq in 2003 was a step in this direction of destroying state authority. The United States went into Iraq, an enfeebled state in terms of its infrastructural power because of bad decisions by its leadership and brutal sanctions. But the United States went in 2003 with the express purpose of destroying the state, in the hubristic belief that it could then easily rebuild a functioning state in Iraq, and we saw the consequences of that. And of course, even preceding 2003, there were states that were infrastructurally weak in the Middle East historically, like Lebanon, for all sorts of distinctive and sometimes idiosyncratic circumstances. But I think that the big effect for international relations is that the uprisings created many more of these political vacuums. Libya, Syria, Yemen, And I think we can add in, this was not a result of the Arab uprisings, but the Palestinian Authority as well, pre-2011. If all of these places in the Arab world, and in the cases of Syria and Iraq, in if you will, the geopolitical center of the Arab world, where the state has been either destroyed, collapsed, or severely challenged. And this, of course, is an enormous conundrum for international relations theories, because international relations theories basically assume, if not billiard ball states, at least functioning states that interact with each other according to certain patterns. And so I think your standard international relations theories are unable to help us explain the international outcomes of the Arab uprisings. I think this is particularly interesting and true and difficult when we think about power, which is, of course, both the most overused and ill-defined concept in international relations and the most important concept in international relations. But it seems to me that what's absolutely clear about the international politics of the region since the Arab uprisings is that military power, that element of hard power that most international relations scholars usually look to first to determine who's on top in an international relations situation, military power is actually not a particularly effective instrument for achieving your goals in this context. What is effective is the ability to mobilize allies, clients, proxies within these internal civil conflicts within these places, within these states where the state has collapsed or been severely challenged, the ability to mobilize support in these internal domestic conflicts has been the most important way that regional and international players have been able to increase their power to win in the contest for influence in the post-2011 Middle East. I mean, we have these really interesting conundrums, right? Israel, which is, I think, widely acknowledged to be the most efficient military power in the region, is practically absent from this contest for power in the Middle East right now. Right? Versus, Lilliputian states like Qatar and the United Arab Emirates that have been, as the phrase that you see most often, punching above their weight in these contests. Because the Qataris and the UAE have that other element of hard power, which is money, of course, to be able to fund and draw toward them actors within these civil conflicts. But even there, I think that even the money aspect of hard power is problematic in terms of analyzing who's up and who's down in the regional conflict in the post-2011 Middle East. Iran, I think, has been the most successful actor in the post-uprisings contest in the region. And it's not because they have the most money. It's certainly not because of their military power. I don't think anyone fears the Iranian army marching across borders to take over, quote unquote, take over countries and territory. And it's not like the Iranians have more money to distribute than the Saudis or the Emiratis or the Qataris for that matter. But what the Iranians have is a network of clients and proxies and allies who are loyal to Iran, who want to be allied with Iran, who share a certain view of the region and a view of legitimate governance with Iran, and are enthusiastic cooperators with Iran. Contrast that, for example, with Saudi Arabia, where what most people would see as the most important, I should say the closest ideological actors to Saudi Arabia are, of course, the Salafi jihadists, Al Qaeda and ISIS. And the Salafi jihadists want to kill the Saudis, right? They hate the Saudis. And so the Saudis don't have those kinds of reliable proxies, allies, clients, the way the Iranians do. And Turkey, who is also playing in this game, of course, the second most powerful military, I'd say, after the Israelis in the region, have been able to realize some gains through military power along the borders with Syria, but they haven't been able to, as I think Mr. Erdogan hoped to do immediately after the uprisings, to form a kind of Turkish-led, bottom-up populist Sunni Islamic bloc through the Muslim Brotherhood, through relations with Muslim Brotherhood countries, because while it looked like the Brotherhood was going to be very successful in the early years after 2011, the Brotherhood has suffered a number of setbacks. All right, so I think that understanding this interesting difference in terms of what effective power is in this contest helps us to understand why the sectarian framing of Middle East politics these days is so problematic, right? I don't want to say that it's irrelevant. I mean, people have been killed since 2011 because of their sectarian identity. It's important, but it's not so much important because Sunnis hate Shia and they have hated them for centuries. It's because within these failed states, within these states where the state, within these countries where the state has been severely challenged, a number of them, for their own historical reasons, sectarian identities have been important and salient in their political histories. And when the state recedes and can't provide the basic order that one assumes a state does, people, of course, will rush to their corners. They will rush to their communities where they feel safe, where they will have their needs met, where they won't be killed. Their children won't be kidnapped. And for idiosyncratic and important historical reasons, in places like Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, some of those identities, not all of them, but some of those identities are sectarian. And so that sectarianism is bottom up, right, rather than top down. And we can see very similar dynamics in a place like Libya where sectarianism plays no role at all, right? Your sub-state identity becomes much more salient when the state can no longer provide basic order and security for you. And thus this more I think that this gives us a more complex picture of an ideological identity map that's not just Sunni Shia, right? There are serious differences among Sunnis, the Turks versus the Saudis and the Emiratis in terms of who they are backing, right? Bottom up, more populist Sunni Islamist groups versus top down state controlled religion. And you have the Salafi jihadists who have no state patron, who are also at play in these places where the state is challenged or collapsed. Okay, so in conclusion, I'm as pessimistic as Melanie is, because if you buy the premise so far, right? If you buy my premise that it's the collapse of state authority and the severe challenge to state authority that creates the particularly pernicious crisis that we're seeing in the Middle East right now, then of course the solution is, well, rebuild the state. Unfortunately, we don't know much about how to rebuild the state. And certainly in the United States, we're extremely good at state destroying and not very good at state building, right? But what we know from historical examples is that state building is really hard. It is usually an extremely violent process, and it takes a long time. So on that happy note, I'm done. Thanks.
Thank you for that very uplifting final message. No, but I really like how both presentations are speaking to each other, and we just got a really interesting take on both the kind of comparative politics and how these domestic politics shift, and now the international relations through these power vacuums. So, thank you, Professor Maradem. Are you going to give us any more hope for the region?
Yes and no. I'm going to shift gears, conceptual gears a little bit here and focus on gender and women's mobilizations. But let me begin by saying that it's really a pleasure to be with you and part of this very stimulating discussion, if a sober one. And I also want to begin by paying homage to the pioneering Egyptian feminist, socialist, physician, and author Nawal Saadawi, who died last month. She was a truly inspirational figure for us all. In our soon-to-be published book, Shamiran and I identify 4 explanatory factors and forces for the divergent outcomes of the Arab uprisings, both immediate outcomes and longer term. We discuss states and political institutions, which of course Greg was just speaking about, civil society, gender relations and women's mobilizations, and international influences or interventions. And we examine both initial conditions and the outcomes. In 2017, I published a piece in the journal Politics, Groups, and Identities on the gender factor, where I compared gender indicators and women's movements on the eve of the uprisings to show how women's legal status, social positions, and movement activism prior to the uprisings helped shape the nature of the uprising, helped shape, for example, whether it was violent or nonviolent, and also the outcomes, especially in terms of measuring outcomes in terms of women's participation and rights, pro-women's legislation, and so on. So examining gender as a feature of the Arab uprisings was a continuation of my earlier comparative work on revolutions and their gender dynamics, where I classified revolutions from the French Revolution on as either patriarchal or emancipatory. And later I found Georgina Whalen's comparative study of gender dynamics and outcomes of democratic transitions very helpful. So in our book, the variable gender relations and women's mobilizations refers to women's social positions, their legal status, their visibility, influence, and presence in the public sphere and public space, the presence or absence of pro-women policies and programs in our 7 country cases, and the nature of family law, whether it's patriarchal or relatively liberal. So taken together, these were the initial conditions which we studied and compared across our 7 cases, and of course, they're also studied in terms of outcomes. Now, this variable is important. It has tended to be understudied in studies of the Arab uprising, except in the feminist literature. But it's important in at least 3 ways, as identified in an array of feminist studies by political scientists and sociologists. First, research by Mary Caprioli, Valerie Hudson, and others associated with the Women's Stats Project has shown that patriarchy and gender inequality are positively associated with both intra-state and interstate conflict. In other words, we can expect less violent conflict when women have a strong presence in civil society and in political society, and the opposite, of course, the converse works as well. Now, the other side of the Women's Stats thesis, and they have an even stronger thesis than what I just explained, pertains to the relationship between patriarchy and military spending. Greg just mentioned militarization. There exists a large literature in feminist IR, feminist international relations, and the women, peace, and security studies scholarship, starting at least with Cynthia Enlow's 1983 book, showing how high military spending not only crowds out social spending, but also reinforces patriarchal institutions, values, and norms. States with high military spending also have a propensity for aggressive foreign policies. Okay, that's one reason. Now, the second reason that the gender variable is important, as I have argued since my 2004 paper for the Arab Reform Bulletin, is that women may or may not need democracy to flourish, but democracy without women is either partial or male biased or frankly impossible. Indeed, the Middle East's absence from democracy's third wave had very much to do with the region's poor rankings on most gender indicators and indices. Many academic studies have shown that women's participation and rights are necessary for democratic development, and the Varieties of Democracy project, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, now makes that same argument in several papers and reports. And there's a third reason why gender is important in understanding the nature of the Arab uprisings and the outcomes. Malatoun and Laurel Weldon, for example, have demonstrated that women's autonomous organizing in civil society accounts for progressive social policies. That is some measure of independent organizational capacity, which could nonetheless involve coalitions with other civil society organizations, as well as ties to elite allies to effect legal or policy reform. And this is exactly what happened, for example, in Morocco with the 2004 family reform. This places such women's groups in a more advantageous position, capable of successfully challenging any potential backsliding on the women's rights that had been achieved before. So the presence of influential autonomous women's rights organizations increases the likelihood that a democratic transition and the new political institutions will be more women-friendly. So drawing on this large literature and on the available data for MENA countries, we identify three categories of we put our 7 country cases in 3 categories. Cases of strong women's rights mobilizations, basically just Morocco and Tunisia, cases of weak women's mobilizations, Bahrain, Libya, Syria, Yemen, and the anomalous case of Egypt, with its long tradition of women's rights and broader political activism, starting in the early 20th century, but continuing with the Nasser era so-called state feminism, but a period of abeyance, if not decline, that starts during the Sadat era and continues during throughout the Mubarak era. So we show that on the eve of the Arab uprisings, women's rights movements were at diverse stages of development, but strongest in Morocco and Tunisia, where gender indicators also were more positive. And the book includes information and data on the new laws and policies post-Arab Spring for women's participation and rights, and the role that women's rights organizations, especially in Morocco and Tunisia, along with their allies in parliament and government, played in the legal and policy advances in those 2 countries in particular. So I think a lot of us realize that Tunisia is the distinctive case of strong autonomous feminist organizations, low military spending, a dynamic civil society, and it was fortunate enough to be deprived of external intervention. In our book, Shamiran and I are very critical of external intervention, especially military intervention or similar actions for regime change, because of all the reasons that Greg mentioned, but also because of the typically adverse effects on the lives, livelihoods, and physical security of women and girls. And of course, Iraq since Iraq 2003 and since, and Libya, Syria, and Yemen 2011 and since are the most obvious examples. So how are women doing? Not well in the countries that I just mentioned. Moreover, all international data sets show that the Middle East still has the widest gender gaps of all regions in education, employment, political participation, though not on health. The female labor force participation rates are still low, and there has been no female head of state in any of the Arab countries. But clearly there are variations across the region on women's physical security, for example, and according to the most recent Arab Barometer data, Tunisia has the lowest percentages of reported sexual harassment, and Egypt the highest. On frequency of domestic violence, the lowest is Tunisia and highest in Yemen. Indeed, according to the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Report for 2020, of the 152 countries measured for women's political empowerment, Tunisia is not only ranked highest of all MENA countries, but at number 67, that's 67 out of 152, it is ranked higher than Malta, Korea, Greece, the US, by the way, which is ranked 86, and Japan, which is ranked 144. So there's some good news as well as the bad news. And in a recent paper that I published in the journal Social Politics, which is part of this international sort of research network and a symposium on what is called the gender regime, I identify the gender regime or the gender order or the gender system in the MENA region as predominantly neo-patriarchal, but Tunisia and Morocco have been transitioning towards a conservative gender regime, such as exists in South Korea and Japan. And the main drivers of this transition from the neo-patriarchal to the conservative include political initiatives and the relative dynamism of civil society, but I especially underscore the significance of feminist research, advocacy, and activism in the changes that have taken place in those two countries in particular. Nevertheless, the legal and constitutional changes in Tunisia that I think everyone is aware of, as well as in Morocco, have not been translated into tangible social policies. And we heard about that from Melanie earlier, and have not been translated into economic development strategies for the advancement of all women in the society, especially those in marginalized or deprived communities. One reason is that the global economic environment is less propitious than it was for third wave democratic transitions or revolutions. And of course, Melanie showed us those very high levels of public spending in MENA countries in the 60s and 70s. But at that time too, the countries that were transitioning in the so-called third wave democratic transition periods, they could rely on considerable assistance from the US or the EU, or in the case of third world revolutions, they could rely on the Soviet Union and socialist bloc countries. The Arab uprisings, however, came much later and in a less propitious period historically, between the Great Recession on the one hand and then the global pandemic more recently. So Tunisia and Morocco in particular have seen some progress, but also considerable stagnation. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Moghadam. I think, you know, what I really appreciate about what you just laid out for us is so much of the focus on women is about how they're disproportionately, for example, impacted by conflict or displacement or gender-based violence. And you remind us that they're not, of course, passive agents, and the inclusion of women in these social movements makes a huge difference for political outcomes. So thank you for that, and thank you for the silver lining of slight good news. I'll turn to Professor Salouk and see if he will keep us with some good news or bring us back down to.
None whatsoever. Thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity to be in such great company. I'm going to talk a bit about the protests, and specifically in Lebanon and Iraq, and draw some comparative lessons. At least this is what I was asked to do. I think there are a number of themes when we think of the trajectory of protests in the Arab world, particularly in divided societies like Lebanon, Iraq. And I want to focus on three main themes. One, the genealogy of these protests and how important this is to the activists. Two, what explains variations in responses to these protests, particularly in places like Lebanon and Iraq. And third, I want to end with talking a bit about the situation in Lebanon today and what are the prospects for the future given the collapse in the country. So I think for thinking about genealogies of protests, particularly the last wave, 2019, especially in Lebanon and Iraq, there is certainly this idea that these are connected to earlier waves, and particularly post 2011. Certainly in Lebanon, protesters saw themselves continuing, protesters in 2019 saw themselves continuing what started in 2011 as, in the case of Lebanon at least, demonstrations under the slogan الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام الطائفي, which is partly the slogan of the Arab revolt. And that was followed in 2015 by the U-Stink protest. And I think in retrospect, 2015 was an important episode because opposition groups, protesters drew important lessons from what happened to 2015, and particularly the way in which the political elite was able to neutralize the 2015 protest and to pulverize the movement. And I think what we saw in 2019, especially in the case of Lebanon, of these decentralized, non-hierarchical protest was a direct lesson from 2015, where at least the organizers of the protest believe that the main lesson of 2015 was that if you enter into broad coalitions, you expose yourself to penetration by the political elite. I want to highlight just one party that emerged out of the 2015 protest, the U-Stink protest, and this is مواطنون ومواطنات في دولة, MAMAFED, as it's known. And what is interesting about MAMAFED is that it's really turns itself from a kind of a protest movement into a political party immediately after 2015, because they learned the lesson of 2015, and that is civil society protest, NGO protest is not the way to go in Lebanon. What you need to do is to establish a political party to preempt what they believed at the time was the coming, and they believed correctly, was the coming collapse. And MAMAFED is important, I think, because it sort of was ahead of all of the other groups that took to the streets in 2019. Now, what happened in 2019 and why did the protest fail, and how can we compare them with what happened in Iran? And of course, what is the role of sectarianism in all this? Of course, I never subscribed to the utility of sectarianism as an explanatory variable, but as Greg said, one has to not so much look at the explanatory role of sectarianism, but how sectarianism is weaponized and instrumentalized by political elites. Now, I think what happened in 2019 and what happened to the protest in 2019 is a direct consequence of the ensemble of practices that the sectarian system has put together since its creation in Lebanon, but much more importantly, what we call the political economy of sectarianism that was organized from the middle 1980s or onward, but certainly in the post-war period. And by that, I mean how the complete capture of the post-war state by what begins as a political economic alliance, mainly the former militia leaders plus Rafiq al-Hariri, and then develops in the late 1990s into a political economic financial alliance, the complete capture of the political economy of the state, the use of that political economy, the complete colonization of civil society, professional syndicates, labor unions, and so on, even NGOs, meant that there really were no alternative avenues, no viable alternative avenues for opposition. And so 2019 was an amplified expression of what these ensemble of practices and this political economy had done to the prospect for oppositional politics. Having said that, it was very interesting also to note how at least Hezbollah instrumentalized sectarianism in 2019 and emerged as the greatest defender of the sectarian system. And in so doing, Hezbollah had turned 180 degrees from its origins when it started as a party that was against the sectarian system and then ends up in 2019 as the main defender of the sectarian system. Now, because of my argument is that because of these ensemble of practices that permeate the institutions of the state, society, because of this political economy of sectarianism, what we saw in 2019 is what John Chalcraft has called a crisis of authority. And because this political economy that was assembled in the post-war years creates its own organizational forms, and by that I mean it allows for the colonization of the places where one expects opposition to come from, and it develops its own ideological hegemony or consent, as Gramsci would like to call it. This meant that the only places where you would have opposition is in the street and in this inorganic, disorganized form. So this was not a revolution. This was rather a crisis of authority that the political, economic, and financial elite in Lebanon was able to contain and to divide. Now, compared to Iraq and the protests that were happening at the same time, what is interesting here is the level of violence used to contain, destroy the protest. My argument is that because in Lebanon, the sectarian system and the capillaries of the sectarian system go deep into society, the political elite really did not need to deploy the amount of violence we saw in Iraq. By contrast, in Iraq, because this post-2003 attempt to impose a sectarian vision of society on Iraqis has failed, this has meant that you had to use immense violence to destroy the protests. And again, the issue of sectarianism is very interesting here. If sectarianism explains anything, then one should not have seen the kind of protests you saw in Iraq, because by and large, these were protests inside the same sect, intra-sectarian protests between those political elites and economic elites who are benefiting from the imposition of muhassasa al-ta'ifiyya and the rest of the population, predominantly the poor Shia in the south, who are not benefiting from this. So Iraq 2019 is a fantastic example of the limits of any kind of sectarian explanation, because the main battle is inside the same sect, and this is the Shia sect. The third point that I want to end with is, okay, if the argument is that a kind of a political economy of sectarianism led to specific organizational forms, that is, the organization of the political system in Lebanon and civil society in a certain way, and led to its own, or created its own consent, its own ideological hegemony in the form of sectarianism. So again, here, sectarianism is not a primordial issue. It's something that is produced and reproduced materially, ideologically. Then what happens when this political economy of sectarianism collapses, which is what we're witnessing today? What happens when the use of fiscal policies, monetary policies, external aid, what have you, leads to the complete meltdown that we are witnessing in Lebanon today? And there are two views on this in Lebanon today. One argument and this is the one that is subscribed to by Memphis, by Muwatinun wa Muwatinat, is that, well, people will now free themselves from their sectarian parties and will join those political parties like Mamafet that had anticipated the collapse and that have their own vision for the creation of a new state. The title of the party, Muwatinun wa Muwatinat fi Dawla, is quite interesting because they are bringing back the notion of the state, but not any state. What they care about is the Dawla al-Madaniya, the civil state. That's one perspective. The other perspective, the more pessimistic perspective, is actually says something as follows. Actually, the political economic elite is more than happy to sacrifice society to salvage the sectarian system that has served and protected their interests and privileges. And in many ways, what has happened in the last year and a half tends to justify the latter perspective, that instead of oppositional movements, anti-sectarian oppositional movements being able to organize, come together, mobilize, and to come up with a viable alternative, what we are witnessing is what the World Bank has called a kind of a deliberate depression, a deliberate strategy by the political economic elite to let the country collapse slowly, because they bet that as the country collapses slowly, they use the term the Titanic is sinking, then people will fall back on their sectarian silos. And of course, the political economic elite in Lebanon, most of them are graduates of the civil war, and they will fall back on civil war tactics and strategies, which mean that each militia leader, a kind of a federalism or a confederalism of violence, each political leader or former warlord will take care of their own community, their own sub-community, their own region. And as the country collapses, people will then offer very little resistance. And those among the strongest political parties also believe, especially Hezbollah, believe that actually our constituency, once they see how the other constituencies are suffering, will be more than happy to fall back on our support and on our position. So on this very optimistic note, I will end my talk, and we're happy to take any questions in the rest of the session. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yes, absolutely depressing. This concept of deliberate depression is fascinating and incredibly frightening, but a very compelling story. And I really appreciate this notion of a political economy around sectarianism. And I think it's interesting how it interacts with what Greg was saying about sectarianism from below. So we will get to all of these connections. I'm eager to engage, but Professor Mako, please, we look forward to hearing from you. And in the meantime, please, to our audience members, feel free to use the chat box so we can make sure to hear your questions.
Thank you so much, Noura. And thanks to all the people who have spoken before me. I'd hate to carry the trend, but I'm going to in terms of some of these stagnation trends that we're seeing. But I will end on a happier note, a line that I think just kind of gives me a bit of hope that I see for the region. But before we start, my presentation is going to mostly look at the factors and forces that were outside of the domestic setting of these countries that influence what happened inside of these countries in the MENA region's largest protest wave. And so I think building on so much of what Melanie, Greg, Basil, and Valentine have already talked about, I'll kind of take it a bit, I guess, more relating to Greg's point about the kind of structural conditions and factors and the ways in which specifically these factors and forces outside the domestic setting influence domestic outcomes and trajectories. And so in the same way that the uprising should, theoretically and empirically really be grounded and analyzed alongside a complex and rich historical continuum of mass mobilization, based on preceding protest movements. And here I share with you a graph. This data came from the mass mobilization data set. And although, prior trends in the 1990s across 3 decades, we saw mass protests taking place in these countries, and at times in really kind of austere conditions and measures. But what we saw in 2010 and 2011 was really this kind of exponential rise, both in terms of the number of protest movements that we saw, and at the same time, the number of people actually protesting or protest events alongside these 7-country case studies that did experience these robust protest movements. And so these patterns of external intervention should really be kind of thought about along the same trends as mass mobilization throughout decades in the Middle East and North Africa. And so external intervention, in particular in the coercive sense, isn't unique to the MENA region, right? In the same way that these protests weren't unique that we saw happening in 2010 and 2011. The 20th century alone saw a host of interventions that altered domestic, regional, and international politics, whether it be colonization, different forms of imperialism, the 1953 coup in Iran, for example, that had reverberating effects on the 1979 Iranian Revolution, or as Greg mentioned earlier, the first Gulf War of 1990, which then really set the path for the 2003 invasion of Iraq. These are but a select few examples. However, what makes the 2011 uprisings unique is that the region-wide diffusion of initially largely peaceful protests in some contexts were followed either immediately or shortly thereafter by external interventions. In this sense, the uprisings were unique not due to the nature of the demands made, as Melanie talked about and as Val talked about, and Basil and Greg before me, whether it be socioeconomic reforms centered around tackling corruption, distributive politics, and political liberalization more broadly, or that people across the region were able to organize, mobilize, and coalesce around these similar grievances across different countries, but because external actors, both within and outside the region, exploited and in many ways alter the domestic trajectories of these states. And this is something, as Val alluded to, we discuss in our forthcoming book. In instances of coercive or militaristic interventions, such as those seen in Bahrain, Libya, Syria, and Yemen in 2011, interventions occurred either in support of ruling autocrats, as in Bahrain, or warring rebel factions at the onset of largely peaceful pro-democracy uprisings, and not as a result of preceding conflicts, right? And this sometimes, in the civil war literature and in the literature on political violence, when we see these kind of diffuse forms of intervention, they happen generally because there's some sort of a conflict that erupts, either interstate conflict or intrastate conflict, but usually in the onset of civil wars. And so these contemporaneous interventions are also, in a sense, unique because they occurred during the region's largest pro-democracy wave, a wave built on prior protest movements. Thus, while populations across several states propelled one of the region's largest pro-democracy movements, external actors saw the uprisings as both threats and opportunities to leverage influence by exploiting domestic conditions. And so, motivated by structural fissures in the regional environment, external actors sought to leverage ideational and material interests in pursuit of competing foreign policy objectives. And I think both Greg and Basil kind of spoke to this notion that identity isn't the driver of these protest movements, but the ways in which identity is sometimes deployed to justify particular ends, is also prevalent in the ways in which actors intervene. And so this had consequential and devastating effects, evidenced by the more violent transitions and outcomes in some places, particularly in the internationalized civil wars in Libya, Syria, and Yemen, in comparison to other states. And so the past decade has really brought to light the nature, scope, and extent of interventions in certain countries and has allowed us to kind of explain their outcomes a bit more. So why does intervention matter, and why is it something we should pay attention to when we look at what's happening in certain countries of the post-Arab uprising trajectories? Foreign intervention often structures conflict and conflict dynamics and processes as external actors look for ways to alter the domestic environment to secure competing geostrategic interests. The past 10 years have really illuminated the ways in which a change or kind of a sudden shock to a regional environment can create a pathway by which regional and international actors evaluate both the uprising's potential threats and opportunities in pursuit of their own geostrategic interests. And as a result, subvert these kind of domestic forms of dissent. Overall, what we observe a decade on is that the simultaneity of the uprisings within this kind of given temporal setting within 2010 and 2011 primed the opportunity structure for intervening states. This enables states inside and outside the region to leverage competing geostrategic interests in certain states experiencing political domestic unrest. And so as interventions varied, so did outcomes, whereas the one-sided intervention in Bahrain at the behest of Saudi Arabia and the UAE within the kind of GCC strategic model of security swiftly restored order and quelled dissent. But multi-sided interventions in Libya, Syria, and Yemen have produced really internationalized civil wars and have completely subverted state capacity in whatever form it existed, in the kind of weak forms that existed in these states. And in Libya, and specifically, this kind of international intervention during the first few months of the uprising in 2011 was ostensibly driven by the need to protect civilians under R2P, the responsibility to protect doctrine, from direct attacks by the regime and to maintain the strategic interests of regional and international players. However, external intervention has accelerated the proliferation of rebel groups, producing a security vacuum sustained by arms imports to warring rebel groups allied with foreign states seeking to exert influence in the country. It just so happens also that Libya has the largest oil reserves of any African state and has the largest oil reserves in North Africa. And so foreign interventions in Syria likewise produced internationalized civil wars and created conditions ripe for proxy warfare between rebel forces seeking to gain territorial control to influence the initial uprising's trajectory. Likewise, in Yemen, the geopolitical and geostrategic interests of international and regional powers, namely the US, the GCC, and the EU, have precluded prospects for justice and accountability and reconciliation in the aftermath of Saleh's ouster. And of course, Iran has also played a key role in kind of internationalizing the conflict there. It remains to be seen if there will be any accountability for Yemen's near destruction and the humanitarian crisis that the people have endured since the Saudi-led intervention and Iranian meddling. Thus, the uprisings illuminated systemic vulnerabilities on a domestic level that allowed external actors to exploit various forms of influence. Here, intervening actors pursued both covert and overt military interventions, either in support of ruling autocrats or competing rebel factions. However, not all interventions have been coercive. And here I'd like to kind of point to this graph that looks at ODA allocations, so official development assistance allocations between 2010, so at the onset of the uprisings, and into 2017, where the latest data is available. Here, in the kind of absence of direct and militaristic interventions in some places, the protest movements in Tunisia, for example, and Morocco and Egypt before 2011 developed organically, right? In all three countries, nonetheless, they've all benefited from foreign aid allocations and commitments from donor countries. This is even before 2010 and 2011, and agencies seeking to maintain geostrategic leverage, in particular, in the case of Morocco and Tunisia from the UAE and Egypt from the United States. Non-coercive forms of influence manifested through military and socioeconomic political aid packages to the aforementioned states has allowed Western states to exert a different type, but also a great degree of influence in the domestic affairs of these countries. And so we've seen an increase, for example, in joint security missions between the United States and different North African states post-2011. That trend had already started to happen, in the lead up to the global war on terror, and specifically post-2003 invasion of Iraq. And those have kind of been sustained even more at post-2011. And so although the Obama administration initially had withheld aid from Egypt in 2014 in the aftermath of the 2013 coup, American aid to Egypt resumed in 2015. And so what we see is that democratization and securitization aid in particular over the past decade illustrates how structures and conditions influence domestic outcomes, even in non-coercive settings or non-militaristic types of interventions. And so to conclude, external states have continuously leveraged various forms of influence in Arab region politics, and in particular during and after the uprisings through things like official development assistance and other forms of economic and military aid, whether it be the EU and American securitization aid to North Africa, or the GCC Marshall Plan to Bahrain and Oman at the onset of the uprisings in Bahrain between 2011 and then in 2013. And so the delivery of military aid, unconstrained arms sales, as we've seen particularly rise under the Trump administration to certain states in the MENA region, and foreign aid to autocratic allies in the region signals support and bolsters their coercive capabilities. The largest ODA and military aid donors to the MENA remain the United States and the EU. And this is something we explain further in our forthcoming book, which since the 1990s have aggressively advocated democracy promotion through military means, but also political conditionality and democracy assistance programs that actually over time have undermined more kind of grassroots and bottom-up levels at changing the systems of these places that have inhibited democracy to begin with. And this is something that Bassel and Melanie have alluded to. And so what the past decades of the uprisings has really taught us is that the success or failure of pro-democracy social movements is really inextricably also linked to the regional and international environment. And to measure outcomes, oftentimes we focus so much on what's happening domestically, but on a kind of larger structural scale, these types of the ways in which the external environment affects domestic outcomes matters equally. And so really what we've also seen is that the COVID-19 pandemic has brought to light just what the human cost of these interventions have been, particularly in places where state capacity was already minimal, in places like Yemen, which had already been the MENA region's poorest country, and definitely with the largest kind of underdevelopment. Even in the minimal sense, state capacity has been undermined over the past decade more so than ever. However, what the pandemic has also highlighted, and I'll end on this kind of more positive note, is that the parallel trends in regional decline alongside growing population demands for an end to external influence, both directly, and this is something that the protests in Iraq have been calling for, both an end to American and Iranian influence in meddling in the state. But also protesters have called really more indirectly on an end to these kind of neoliberal economic restructuring schemes that have, and we see protesters in Lebanon and Iraq calling on this, that have really in many ways sustained the crony capitalism that we've seen that Melanie and Bassel and others have alluded to. And so you have this kind of parallel trend, even in the midst of a global pandemic, protesters are taken to the streets calling on these kinds of both coercive and non-coercive forms of intervention to end. And oftentimes what we've seen from slogans coming out of these largely youth-led protests is that really part and parcel and a precondition to political change requires this kind of a pushback against these forms of influence and interventions, which again signals that these interventions have resonated with local populations, right, in these domestic states. They've kind of seen the outcomes of these interventions across time, and they're calling for their end, in as much as they're calling for an end to kind of these larger domestic factors that have sustained and ingrained patterns of authoritarianism and political decline. And so I'll leave it at that, and I'm happy to go into the Q&A and go through some of this data more.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Amiran. We have two questions in the chat box. I'm going to read them out and pose them to the panel. I also have a question for all the panelists. I also want to just remind our audience members to please, thank you, Nabil, you turned on your video, to please feel free to turn on your videos and engage with, raise your hands. And Nabil, for the purpose, since you typed up your chat, I'm going to read it out, which is it wants us to remember the importance of climate change. So aside from high population growth rates, declining rainfall in several states, in particular in Tunisia and Syria, led to impoverishment of their farming areas and a rise in food prices. For example, the first uprising in Syria broke out in Daraa, which has been the major apricot production area, but lost most of its fruit trees and main source of local income in 2010 due to a 5-year drought that began in 2005. So thank you for reminding us how important climate change is, and I welcome all our panelists to reflect on that. I'm really curious, Val, whether the gender factor in climate change it interacts in interesting ways, or maybe I'm extrapolating there. The second question from Jenna, one of our students. Thank you, Jenna. Very thoughtful question. And she says, reflecting on Dr. Gauz's framing of power and perceptions of threat, what are lessons learned from the perspective of authoritarian regimes during this period? What variations in repression, co-optation, or coup-proofing have we witnessed? Broadly, what are the characteristics of authoritarian learning from 2011 to today? So thank you, very thoughtful question. And I think it kind of, shifting from what the Authoritarians Are Us network is learning, what have we as, how have our methods changed? So this question comes from Melanie's point about these new attempts to measure inequality and capture, that we're missing some of the high net worth consumption patterns. But it also makes me think of a piece that Greg wrote a decade ago in Foreign Affairs that was Why Middle East Studies Missed the Arab Spring, the myth of authoritarian stability. And so for our panelists, I'm just curious, our subjects have clearly changed over the past decade. Have our methods, have the ways that you've looked for factors, done your work, changed as a result of the Arab Spring? And because I'm not sure how many rounds we'll have, I'll also, Kamil, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Will the 2019 Iraqi protests reap any harvest in the upcoming Iraqi elections in October, or would we see sectarianism and gerrymandering bolstering the current elite's position? So maybe Shamran, you might want this, or Basa, whoever wants to take these questions.
If I may, I beg your pardon. Just want to make a quick comment on the authority, the power of the governments over the last 10 or 11 years. One of the factors that helped the Arab Spring protests succeed was technology. Sending and receiving of especially GSM SMS messages helped to organize the crowds. What has happened since then is that governments have invested heavily in technology so that they can monitor their populations in a way they couldn't even monitor them before the uprisings. So I think the role of government investment in technology and the ability to manage even information and to be able to identify the troublemakers long before they're able to organize has made many of these governments almost as powerful as the Chinese Communist Party in controlling their populations. And with regard to what has happened since then, I think what happened is due to the violence and the economic decline after the first uprisings, the middle classes in all these countries were so scared, got so scared that they have pulled back from any protests, have just accepted what has happened and just tried to get along as best as they can. They're just afraid, more worried about chaos as in Iraq, for example, than anything else right now.
Thank you, Nabil. So climate change, middle class, technology, and maybe changing nature of warfare is built in there too. So thank you. I'll turn to our panelists in any order. We can go in the order of the program, or I'll let you kind of jump in to answer any combination of these questions.
I think I'll take on the question on Iraq, and Basil can certainly fill in some of the blanks that I'll leave. But it's interesting because, the system that was put in place for Iraq was in some ways, bared a lot of resemblance to the system that was put in Lebanon. It's why these two countries are compared quite often, right? This idea that you have a constant, although in Iraq it's quite informal, we have a consociational power sharing model that basically allows and allocates and distributes parliamentary seats and key governing ministerial positions to particular, major political power blocks. Will the 2021 October elections bring about any change? I hate to be pessimistic, but I am, because so much of what the protesters have been calling on is the kind of a structural change to the same institutional mechanism that has allowed these massive coalitions, sectarian coalitions, to profit, but also to exploit and distribute the spoils of governance along really well-established sectarian fault lines. And this really isn't different from, how the two ruling parties in Iraqi Kurdistan also operate, right? And oftentimes we kind of think that the parallel processes that are happening in Iraqi Kurdistan is different from what's happening in Baghdad. And it really isn't when we think about the power distribution that the KDP and the PUK have over governance in the KRG as well. And so it's a bit tricky because Iraq did pass an election law, reformed its election law in November of 2020. Key part of those reforms ignited, a lot of issues, especially amongst communities, minority communities, and the Iraqi Sunni community abroad, because it prescribed diaspora voting. And so for various kind of technological reasons and security reasons, Iraqis abroad can't vote in the October 2021 election. And so that brought about a lot of resentment from, key factions inside the country and outside the country. But in terms of the actual, do we see a change in the people who are running for government? Do we see a change in the people who are running these major political power blocks in both the north and in the rest of Iraq? We don't really see that. And so, I think it's safe to assume that you're going to see a bit of shifting or recycling in these coalitions and how power is allocated and distributed, key ministerial positions, which is really the hub of where power is allocated alongside the executive branch of government. I don't suspect that we're going to see big change in outcomes in the October 2021 election, although I hope I'm wrong. And so I'll just kind of leave it at that. I don't know if Bassel wants to jump in as well.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, Camille is Lebanese, so he knows the Lebanese system very well. But I would just add that what you said says a lot about the importance of organization and how these protest movements do not really have the institutional infrastructure to organize. And if the last elections were any in Iraq were any measure when the ICP allied with Muqtada, thinking that they can use Muqtada Sadr to enter parliament, well, he ended up using them and then broke away from them. So and Camille's question, I think, has resonance with Lebanon. And this is really the 1 million question. If we hold elections, parliamentary elections today in Lebanon, how many of these protest movements, parties can actually enter a parliament? And I think it all has to do with the electoral law and the kind of alliances that end up being negotiated before elections. But the common feature is the fact that in Iraq and Lebanon, the protesters lack the kind of organizational capabilities that one needs as a precondition to challenge the system.
Can I jump on this very interesting discussion and pose a question to the Iraq specialist? Because, I'm wondering whether and to what extent the women in parliament, and there is a gender quota in Iraq, and there is a fairly high representation of women, although I don't know very much about the kinds of bills that they adopt and that sort of thing. And I'm wondering if they are trying to transcend these sectarian divides. Are they building any kind of caucus, women's caucus, or are they just marching in line behind the sectarian groupings? Are they making any difference at all? Does anyone know? I was on another webinar a couple of weeks ago, USIP, United States Institute for Peace, and there was an Iraqi specialist there, and she was actually very pessimistic about the women in parliament in Iraq, but I don't know if anyone else has any information.
I think from what we've seen, Val, is there's definitely, my colleague and friend Zahra Al-Ali's work actually speaks to this, and looking at the different feminist movements in Iraq, and the ways in which, one of the arguments that she makes and has been made elsewhere is that you're seeing a kind of like a diffused, to Basil's point, non-structural forms in which women and civil society organizations in general have come to organize and coalesce around key kind of common interests. And so we've seen a lot of intercommunal solidarity and cooperation amongst different women's movements in Iraq. But at the same time, I think, not to be too pessimistic, but the structural barriers to women's integration and having that kind of meaningful capacity to influence legislation or to influence policy more broadly is quite restrictive. And so you may have these, you know, the quota systems, I think like each coalition has to have like 25 or 28% of seats allocated for women. But we really haven't seen a kind of a positive, either legal or political trend towards, you know, female or women mobilization and women's empowerment in the country. And so there's a bit of a decline there, and that trend has continued. And so, but at the same time, you know, we have seen women and women's civil society organizations really be front and center in these protest movements. And so there's kind of a lot to speak to that. Most people recall a few years ago, there was this push by conservative lawmakers in Iraq to adopt a component of the Jafari law that would effectively, in some ways, make child marriage legal through Islamic jurisprudence. There's a lot of opposition to that, and opposition both coming from obviously women's movements, opposition coming from civil society, but also major political power blocks in the country that kind of, you know, subverted that effort. But we've seen, especially I think some of the recent data coming out of the pandemic, is that, you know, across the board, and I think this is reflective of many countries around the world and countries in the region, you see a rise in domestic violence. And of course, you know, the question of Iraqi women has to also be set in context with the trauma and genocide experience of minority Iraqi women at the onset of ISIS's takeover of Mosul in 2014. Yazidi women and some Christian women, Turkoman women who were really subjected to modern day forms of slavery. And so there's that component to the question of women and gender mobilization and empowerment. And that component, you know, in its most kind of violent articulation really hasn't been addressed. Although there was a genocide law that was passed in Parliament at the beginning of March, and that passed through, that recognized a genocide against, you know, the Yazidi community, the Christian community, and the Turkoman community by ISIS. The question then becomes, what do we do for these communities, and specifically these women who need, you know, all sorts of care, physical care, psychological care, and obviously, you know, socioeconomic aid to kind of help them, you know, cope. But, you know, that political will just, you know, I haven't seen a lot of positive indicators that there's an effort to deal with these really important questions facing Iraqi women. And women in Iraqi Kurdistan face similar barriers too, right? In terms of integration and things like that. So, you know, for example, there was it was in 2014 that Iraqi Kurdish lawmakers banned female genital mutilation, which Iraqi Kurdistan has some of the highest rates of in the region, and certainly higher than the rest of Iraq. But there really hasn't been, there are a lot of Kurdish activists who are working on this issue to make the law meaningful in terms of application and implementation, you know, 6-7 years after it was passed. And so there's this kind of parallel trend again of mass social mobilization and organization, but in terms of political action, you know, I haven't really seen a lot of positive trends.
I beg your pardon. I have a question, Shamiran.
Sorry, maybe because we actually only have 6 minutes left, and we also have a couple of other questions here. That I want the other speakers haven't gotten a chance to respond to any of the questions, so I do want to give.
Okay.
I'm sorry, but we will have the next session, and very much welcome you to contribute. Greg, go ahead, please.
I just want to take up very briefly the really interesting question from Ms. Kalai, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, about authoritarian learning. And I think that I don't have really well-formed responses to that, but it does seem to me that like the people who have succeeded, the authoritarians who have succeeded have doubled down to some extent, right? If you succeeded through mobilizing sectarianism, you continue to mobilize sectarianism. If you succeeded by throwing money at people, you will throw money at people. I think the Saudis are very interesting on this point, because even though there's interesting changes happening in the political economy of Saudi Arabia under Vision 2030, it is still kind of the state control. In fact, the state becoming even more involved in the private sector than perhaps it even was before, if one can imagine that, through the Public Investment Fund. And Nabil and I can talk about that offline. But I do think that probably the most interesting thing is for the non-oil states, the places that did succeed in maintaining their authoritarian structures, can they move away from neoliberal policies that as Melanie pointed out, help to create the inequalities that we think helped fuel the uprisings of 2011? I don't know if they can, because what's the alternative model, and where are they going to get the capital to conduct or to follow an alternative model? That, to me, places like Egypt and Tunisia and Morocco, I think that's going to be really, really interesting. So that's a great question of what have the authoritarians learned from 2011, and I think it probably differs from case to case.
Please, Melanie.
Great. Yeah, Greg, I'm glad you brought that up, because fundamentally, all of these economies have to build productive foundations, and that's the major challenge. And I think it was Shamiran who brought in the and Valentine who brought in the international dimension and the international context. And this is really critical here, because when we think of high growth political economies like the East Asian developing countries, they developed in a very different global context. And so this is not the economic global context that we live in today. Not to mention that, as Basil was pointing out, for the case of Lebanon, but I think this generalizes across the region, economic elites are, very tightly connected to political elites, if not synonymous with them in some cases, and don't have an interest in bringing about a fundamental change to political economies. So it's so even if they did, the challenge would be enormous as it is in this global economic context, but there's also this added layer. So I want to say just a couple of things in response to what has come up, and I'll be quick. I mean, the climate change question I think is incredibly important. I think there's been this bizarre absence in my discipline in political science of research on climate change, which is really crazy, because we know the largest binding constraint is politics in addressing the climate change challenges. And I think there's lots of room for this generally, and also on the Middle East. To do more work on this, and not just descriptively, but explaining variation and approaches to climate change across nationally and so forth. On the repression question, I totally agree that there's variation cross nationally in how governments have approached this. Some have doubled down, some like the Moroccos and Jordans, who are really dependent on having a sort of positive global image, particularly in the West, do this more subtly. I will say one thing, I ran a survey experiment with some colleagues in Lebanon looking at how effective sectarian appeals are and fear-based sectarian appeals are. And we found some interesting findings that suggest that the population doesn't buy them, particularly certain segments of the population, and actually has demand for an alternative set of rhetoric from politicians. It doesn't mean they're going to rise up and mobilize and overturn the system, because that's a more complicated process, but there is definitely latent demand for not using these appeals. And then the last thing I want to say about methods, which also ties into the technology question, is we all know that in many places, not all in the region, it's been much harder to do field work because of repression, not to mention the pandemic. And so some people in political science have been moving more and more to this big data, social media analysis. And so there is some really interesting work that I'm sure we're all familiar with, looking at how governments use social media, not only how activists use it, but how governments use it to track and surveil opposition. What's interesting here, and one of my actually undergraduate students has been working on this, is that places like Saudi don't own the social media platforms, whereas in China, you have a lot of social media exchanges going on platforms that are in China and can be more easily directly controlled by the state. So it's a slightly different dynamic here, but still, in all cases, governments are using them to surveil population. So it is certainly a double-edged sword, the way that technology is utilized.
Thank you. I don't know, Val, if you want to respond to any of the comments, or if there's any one of the panelists who feel like they didn't get a chance to answer. I know Shamiran might have a comment, but I just want to check if anyone else.
I just wanted to point out that, of course, the environmental situation, the dire environmental situations, pollution and climate change in the region, I think are well known, but as Melanie pointed out, tend to be under research and underappreciated. We know that in the mining region, the Gafsa mining region in Tunisia, for example, the environmental conditions are really quite dreadful, and the degradation of that region, as well as the infrastructural underdevelopment, and of course, very high unemployment, and of course, poverty. And this in the major mining region of Tunisia motivated protests, both before 2010, 2011, and of course, afterwards and since then. And we know that many women have been involved in those protests again as well, whether individually or as part of their families and kinship groups. So I'd be really interested to know if climate change in Tunisia and Syria, exacerbated those declining economic conditions that Melanie was telling us about, and the deteriorating public services as well. But it does tend to be under-researched, unlike other regions. One thing that I do want to say, and this is a little bit piggybacking on what Shamiran was saying, I think, about the lack of political will in some cases. Again, going back to Tunisia, a country that I've studied a fair amount and visited a fair amount, and am rather fond of, to be honest, and also admire in terms of what they have tried, to accomplish since 2011. I feel that the political will does exist and has existed in Tunisia for, a real transformational change. And I feel that Tunisia could have, and in fact, most of the population and even most of the political elites wanted to turn Tunisia into a kind of social democracy, and that shift in the gender regime that I was mentioning earlier would, mirror and complement that kind of social democratic shift, with kind of high social spending, low military spending, emphasis on women's development, participation, and rights, and so on. But as I mentioned, it's stuck in a global economic environment that is not conducive to this type of assistance and support for infrastructural development, social spending, programs for the alleviation of and elimination of poverty, addressing the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and and so on. So the dire economic conditions, I think, prevent the realization of that political will and of that, I think, goal back in 2011 to turn Tunisia into a kind of social democracy. And it also leads to the sort of political dysfunction that we have been seeing with change of government and, ministers and so on and so forth. So, I would say that the problem really lies in the historic misfortune of the Arab uprisings, of having fallen in the 21st century, in the years following the financial collapse and the Great Recession, and this chaotic, neoliberalized, militarized world. And that's, I think, the great tragedy of the Arab uprisings.
And on that uplifting note, I think we will take a 10-minute break and come back at the top of the hour, 11 o'clock, for another second powerhouse panel that will feature Professor Yadav, Professor Nugent, Professor Haddad, and Professor Cavatorta. So thank you all for being here. Thank you to our panelists for a fantastic first session. We really appreciate it. I'd love to give you, too bad we can't hear everyone applauding, but I'd love to applaud you and thank you again for being here. Greg, you will be missed. Enjoy admissions, and everyone else, please stick around. We'll be back in 10 minutes.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the second round of panels on the Arab uprisings, progress and stagnation, a decade on. For the second panel, we've got 4 participants lined up, beginning with Professor Stacy Filbert-Yadav, who is an associate professor of political science at Hobart and William Smith Colleges. She specializes in the comparative politics of the Middle East and teaches classes in Middle East politics, comparative politics, and Islamic political thought. Her research focuses on the role of Islamist organizations in the transformation of public spheres. And over the past 10 years, she has lived and conducted research in Lebanon, Yemen, Egypt, and Israel. Professor Bassam Haddad is the director of Middle East and Islamic Studies program and associate professor at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. He specializes on the political economy of development, violence, terrorism, and US foreign policy, and knowledge production and pedagogy. Professor Elizabeth Nugent is assistant professor of political science at Yale University. Her research focuses on the politics of authoritarianism, political psychology, and the Middle East. Her research explores political behavior in authoritarian contexts, religion, and politics, the origins of coercive institutions, and she combines and incorporates a variety of really creative survey, voting, archival, interview evidence, and quantitative and qualitative experimental methodologies. Lastly, we have Professor Francesco Cavatorta, who's a professor of political science at the University of Laval in Quebec, Canada. His research focuses on democratization and authoritarianism in the Arab world and dynamics of civil society and political parties and Islamist movements, as well as the general international relations of the region. His current research project focuses on party politics in North Africa and the convergence between voters and parties' manifestos, something that he'll hopefully speak to over the next hour or so. So without further ado, I'll pass the virtual stage over to Professor Filbert-Yadav. And you'll have the floor. Stacy, I think you can already share your PowerPoint. Yeah? Okay, great.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And I was having a little difficulty before we started this morning with the way the sharing was working. I'm hoping things will be okay now. So I've been asked to speak about Yemen. 6 of the 10 years since the Yemeni uprising have been spent under really punishing conditions of war. And one of the most important, arguably the most important feature of the conflict is, and has been for several years, its fragmentation. This fragmentation can be read as a kind of deficit, or through a deficit lens that focuses on state failure, the destruction of state institutions, etc. And I think, I've contributed to that framing as well. But my research over the past couple of years has highlighted some important consequences of the fragmentation and kind of unplanned decentralization in terms of the capabilities of non-combatant civil actors. So civil actors are meeting needs and serving communities all over the country, and they're articulating forward-looking visions for Yemen that barely register on the international peace brokering agenda. So it's that gap that I really want to focus on today. I first want to say something about the data that I'm drawing on, or the research, and this relates to the earlier question about research methods. So I've participated, fieldwork's been really impossible for me under these conditions, but I've participated in 2 collaborative research teams with Yemeni researchers since 2019. The first was sponsored by CARPO and GIZ in Germany, focused on the role of women in peace building in rural and urban communities. And the second, which is in the pre-publication, we've sent the final draft, but sponsored by Interpeace and conducted with Yemeni Youth Without Borders, which is a Taiz-based CSO, was focused on the role of peace building CSOs in Yemen. So across these two projects, we conducted interviews and focus group discussions with hundreds of civil actors across 13 communities in the country, living under the political control and military control of at least 4 different conflict actors and under different kinds of conflict conditions. And we supplemented this with interviews with international agencies and foreign governments. The overwhelming lesson from these interviews and discussions, and one which is echoed in much of the policy analysis of the war that exists, is that this is not just one war. So this map, which is from our Interpeace report, shows 4 central conflict actors: the government in yellow, the Southern Transitional Council in blue, the Houthi movement or Ansar Allah in the dark green, and forces under the command of Tariq Saleh in the kind of olive green. And you can see here 7 different conflict zones characterized by different combinations of these actors. I'll say I think this is stylized and the reality is even more variegated, but these were the groupings that emerged most clearly from our research. So this fragmentation is enormously significant. It shapes the material and non-material needs of local communities, and it's eroding a concept of the national every year as the war goes on. This is strikingly at odds with the framework for peace negotiations, which is something that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. Fragmentation has significant economic dimensions, which fuel the hunger and broader humanitarian crisis in the country. As you probably know, Yemen is highly dependent on food imports. Over 90% of its grain comes from outside of the country, and the country has been largely cut off for most of 6 years. But food does circulate in Yemen, which raises a really good question: why? Its circulation is an important source of revenue for militias, and it's central to the self-sustaining war economy that is becoming increasingly entrenched. As food moves through the country, it gets taxed by militias that control local roads. And each tax adds on. By the time food reaches the markets, it's priced beyond the reach of most households. This is particularly acute for the 8 million Yemenis who rely on civil service salaries that have gone largely unpaid since 2016, as well as for pensioners. And that itself is a function of fragmentation, right? Because the President Hadi moved the central bank out of the capital. So political and military fragmentation has meant cut salaries and pensions, higher prices, and also essential revenue for militias. We're effectively in a situation where war pays the bills for the few at the expense of the many. With limited access to food and little money to buy it, humanitarian aid has become essential to the survival of more than 80% of Yemen's population and is nearly universally necessary for children. The problem that comes with that is that humanitarian aid itself has been politicized by conflict actors. It's given to loyalists and it's denied to others. It's also reproducing entrenched forms of inequality that exist in the country before the war, along gender dimensions and other dimensions. Last week I went to a great presentation about the way Muhammadin, or Black Yemenis, are being cut from recipient roles for donor assistance that's been earmarked for their community. So this type of behavior is the worst under areas of Houthi control, but the problem exists throughout the country in areas under control of all conflict actors. There wasn't a single part of the country where people did not bring this up in our interviews. Lastly, and important to my focus, conflict fragmentation has limited the agency of Yemeni peace builders, both implicitly and explicitly. So implicitly, international donor agencies are responding to the scale of the humanitarian crisis by pressuring peacebuilding CSOs to abandon their peacebuilding work and function as direct purveyors of humanitarian aid, or as deliverers of humanitarian aid. But they themselves widely understand the war as being a causal driver of the food and humanitarian crisis. They find it hard to attract funding for peacebuilding, but there's ample support for aid delivery or for work in needs assessment for international NGOs and UN agencies. More explicitly, in several areas of the country, CSOs are prohibited from engaging in peacebuilding work. This can happen through force by conflict actors or through regulations by their corresponding authorities who view peacebuilding work as political, and it is political. This can be a comprehensive ban, as we see in Houthi areas, or it can be targeted against CSOs with specific affiliations, especially those aligned with Islah. But where there are deficits in institutions or in security, in access to the requisites of a dignified life, people become assets. So in focus groups and interviews across the country, CSO staff identified practices that addressed local or even hyperlocal drivers of conflict. Non-combatant civil actors negotiated road reopenings, interrupt the recruitment of child soldiers, prevent early marriage, run schools without resources and often without pay. So if the war economy keeps militias going, it's civil actors who are keeping their communities going. But this emphasis on survival underestimates the scope of the work that non-combatants are doing to support peace. Peace-building CSOs are really working to address torn social fabric in their communities, the increase in sectarianism, institutionalized gender discrimination, many forms of Manichaean rhetoric that are fueling violence. The critique that they have of international peace brokering takes two forms. The first is that the international peace brokering framework is broken, and I'll talk about that in a second. But the second is that the rhetoric and practices of civil society inclusion are narrowly focused on consultation and voice. We need to consult with Track 3 actors. We need to integrate the voices of Track 3 actors. Civil actors consistently expressed a desire for substantive roles in decision-making and in the design of the negotiated settlement that international peace brokers work on. So many civil actors spoke of feeling squeezed out of substantive planning for peace by the joint actions of conflict actors on the one hand and international peace brokers on the other. This owes in part to some profound structural barriers at the international level. The first is UN Security Council Resolution 2216. It understands the conflict. This is the resolution that authorized the Saudi-led coalition. It understands the conflict in binary terms as a conflict between state and insurgency, and that's not a realistic reflection of the conflict as it is occurring. This has delayed negotiations and produced unrealistic agreements. For example, the Stockholm Agreement, which didn't even come about until 2018, was so unsustainable that within a year it required a second agreement, the Riyadh Agreement, just to temporarily settle a conflict among parties who were nominally on the same side at Stockholm. This has an effect on the work of the UN Special Envoy for the Secretary General for Yemen. This office works hard to achieve progress, but it works within the parameters of 2216. In the view of many of the respondents that we spoke with, it's seen as wasteful and misaligned to local realities, but also it privileges diaspora voices over Yemeni civil actors on the ground. Interviews with office staff confirmed this impression. Staff do not feel free to engage with CSOs that are not directly advancing 2216, and so they actually bypass a lot of the work, the peace building work that is going on. The last structural barrier I'd like to discuss is more of a wild card. It might be a barrier, but it has the potential to kind of disrupt the diplomatic stalemate. The appointment of a U.S. Special Envoy for Yemen, Timothy Lenderking, is a welcome increase in U.S. engagement and signals a wider rethinking in U.S. policy. But respondents expressed concern about duplication, without clarity about how the U.S. Special Envoy would relate to the work of the UN Special Envoy. It's not clear to people whether or not this is just adding one more actor to an already multi-actor equation. And I do share this concern. But I also see it as a source of opportunity. The U.S. Special Envoy operates freer from the constraints of 2216. It may be possible, though early signs are mixed, that the U.S. Special Envoy is ready to directly engage Yemeni civil actors as central agents in designing the kind of agreement and post-conflict institutions that could support peace. It's not clear, and his most recent trip, as I said, was kind of a mixed bag, and I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. I'd like to end with a provocative statement, and I've thought kind of hard about whether or not to use this. It comes from an activist in Taiz. And Taiz is a city that is emblematic of the fragmentation of the war. It's been divided since 2015 between several conflict actors, but also emblematic of civil action. It's been the long-standing heart of Yemen's civil society, and it's where many very vibrant CSOs, peace-building CSOs especially, are based today. One respondent there said regarding the scenario that I've described, peace cannot be achieved through food baskets. Oops, sorry. Across our interviews and discussions, Yemenis view the humanitarian crisis, which is indeed staggering, as derivative of war, and where the war is seen as derivative of forms of political exclusion. They fear, as do I, that international and domestic pressure on CSOs to walk away from peace-building work and focus on humanitarian relief will contribute to prolonging conflict by robbing peace brokers of essential human assets. This is not to be indifferent to the suffering of the war in Yemen. The suffering, it's to come at that suffering not only through a lens of deficit and an analysis of what's missing, but also an awareness of what or who is there and struggling for a role. Yemen has a civil society that has miraculously remained really engaged throughout the 6 years of punishing war and has an intimate understanding of both the drivers of conflict and the requisites of reconciliation. And civil actors in Yemen stand ready, I think, not to restore, which is the framework of 2216, but perhaps to reimagine after this decade of profound loss. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stacey. That was incredibly insightful. It's definitely things that, you know, aren't on the radar of, you know, everyday analyses of Yemen. I think what's interesting is you're pointing to, it's almost like the UN is going against its own mandate and shifting away from structural top-down peace building to more like bottom-up hybrid forms of peace that are more localized. And it seems like it's pushing against that, even though it's advocating it in other contexts. And so that's really fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing that. I will give the floor to Bassam Haddad, who will speak about Syria. So Bassam, go ahead. Do you need to screen share, Bassam?
No, I'm fine. Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you very much, everyone, and Shamiran in particular for inviting me and for holding this panel with these illustrious scholars and experts. I am excited to be here, and I actually have taken a lot more notes than I thought I would, which is awesome, always good. I want to start by saying that in the interest of full disclosure, as some might know, I have been involved in a project under the title 10 Years On, Mass Protests and Uprisings in the Arab World, which is the culmination of years of tracing developments in the Arab countries in which mass protests and uprising took place. This is a 1-year-long collective project that includes 17 universities and research centers and institutions across the US, Europe, and the Middle East, and you can find more about it at thearabuprisings.org. So when I heard about this panel and was invited, I was very excited to participate. I will share my comments in a series of observations that will be, I mean, I have to cut them down to something that I can do in 10 minutes. So I'll start with affirming that 10 years on, the question of uprising outcomes is important, even if perpetually premature. During the past 2 years, for instance, we witnessed a series of additional and consistent mass protests in 4 more countries: Lebanon, Algeria, Sudan, and Iraq. We're also likely to witness additional flare-ups, narrow and wide, local and ubiquitous, in years to come. And we're also likely to witness flare-ups in countries that actually already witnessed severe uprisings and violence in 2011 and beyond. Thus, my first and fastest observation is that it is difficult to make any conclusive statements about results and outcomes, whether positive or not. However, we can assess existing conditions, trends, and the enormous data that is increasingly available even in places like Syria. My second observation is about the temporality of the uprisings and the increasingly difficult or complex notion and practice of revolution in the 21st century. To think of the uprisings as an event with discrete beginnings and ends robs them of their human, institutional, and certainly of their historical dimensions. Rather, these uprisings represent an overdue unfolding or overflow of discontent, resentment, and outright anger and indignation by cross-sectional masses, even if sometimes spearheaded by the most marginalized and those who have the least to lose. Instead, we may think of the uprisings as being in the state of becoming. That is, because of the manner in which most states in the contemporary period are over-securitized, hyper-connected to local, regional, and international actors and interests, and have generally succeeded in providing a modicum of redistribution and welfare at some point, Notwithstanding endemic repression and rising social polarization in the past quarter century, because of all such developments that constitute various levels of entrenchment, resilience, and consolidation, the ebbs and flows we are witnessing and the disillusionment that has come with them is perhaps the best we can hope for in the short to medium run. In other words, it is too early to write off the uprisings as stagnant or to celebrate advancements as linear, as we have been duly instructed by the forces and outcomes of counter-revolution, ones that speak to the earlier point of connectedness based on material and strategic resources. Incidentally, the dearth of connectedness in this context is a blessing which gave us the least amount of disillusionment embodied in the case of the albeit teetering Tunisia, connectedness and disconnectedness from the international global political structures and political economy. My third observation is a bit of a downer and relates to the actual framing of the uprisings. I have argued in previous texts and contexts, as well as lectures and panels and conferences, that we unnecessarily limit ourselves if we continue to see the Arab uprisings as the unit of analysis. The Arab uprisings as a whole as the unit of analysis, especially when sometimes they're called the Arab Spring, which is one of the few things in the world that infuriate me. And I will skip talking about this for now. Instead, and after we exhaust the commonalities which are there, it is more productive to consider. Can you hear me? Sorry about that. It said my connection is unstable. I'm not at home. Okay, I have to repeat the whole thing because I don't know where I'm at right now. No, I'm joking. 1 second. So I have argued that we limit ourselves if we consider the Arab uprisings as the unit of analysis. It is more productive to consider the individual cases. After we exhaust the commonalities, we can consider the individual cases as the unit of analysis, despite and over and above the evident commonalities, domino effect, and the demonstration effect. Yes, the cases initially influenced each other within the Arab context, but like a deist god, that factor of commonality left and lapsed for the most part, leaving each case to its own devices. Thus, the first step is to go back once again to disaggregating the notion, perhaps of the entire Middle East or even the Arab world, as we often, intentionally or not, speak of the uprisings across the region in monolithic terms, and that applies to myself as well. I have been advocating since the eruption of the term Arab uprisings that this is not one event, as so many address it often, especially in the broader media and journalism circles, which is the original sin that produced the term Arab Spring. In other words, as we consider the past 10 years closely, we would be much better off analytically as well as politically at some level if we disaggregate the term. The uprisings, the Arab uprisings, is not one event, but a series of events with different conditions and dynamics, cadence, space, relations, institutions, endowments, not to mention societal differences regarding relative homogeneity, heterogeneity of social groups, distribution, and so on. Instead, beyond the enduring cultural commonalities that helped shape the demonstration or domino effect at the outset, I see research and write and teach the Arab uprisings as a set of 6 or 10 separate cases or more, one hopes, with some cross-cutting effects, networks, and processes that influence, but do not in any way, shape, or form fundamentally alter the unfolding of events in the respective cases. True, there are serious commonalities and common denominators, but these don't help us understand the full spectrum of trajectories we observed. To develop a deeper understanding, we may adopt a dialectical approach that emanates with the broader regional context, but lands on the individual cases and address them on a case-by-case basis, even if we do this without jettisoning the region or the notion of the Arab world, which is another term that we can also disaggregate because of the existence of various ethnicities and so on. The extent of regional and international intervention and the adverse effects they have invariably had historically and during the uprisings in Libya, Bahrain, Syria, and Yemen is something that is crucial here. It's one of the reasons I'm writing my second book, Shamiran spoke convincingly about the deleterious effects of intervention and how they structure conflicts in ways that shift them from any organic track to something else. The effects of such intervention are more than immediate and expansive death and destruction. They create new actors, means, and conflicts that are often far removed from the interests of the originally warring sides. In Libya, and this is, by the way, my third observation. I think I missed saying that. No, that's my fourth observation. In Libya, intervention aimed at toppling the regime. In Bahrain, at saving it. In Syria and Yemen, intervention involved both supporting and defeating the regime, or in Yemen's case, whoever was in apparent control. But we also need to acknowledge that behind all the critique of intervention lies states or actors or other actors with agency and interests. These interests can be essentialized and in some cases become the putative cause of all ills. This would be the imperialism black box, the reductionist argument that overdetermines imperialism at the expense of local accountability and the erasure of local forms of agency. Critiquing this reductionism is healthy, but the trend today, the fashion, the fad today of throwing the imperialist baby with its bathwater is detrimental. Overemphasizing imperialism is erroneous, just as associating imperialism with just the West is faulty. But imperialism is real and has been destructive historically and presently. It is also not just another variable. It is one of the few structuring variables that actually structures relations and conflicts. It can neither be the only factor nor addressed as a caveat before moving on to analyze as though we've already accounted for it. So people write and say, okay, there's imperialism, but we need to go beyond it. That does not actually comport with rigorous analysis. And I can say more about this and how to incorporate if need be. Thus, in the context of the Arab uprisings, one path is to navigate the impact of anti-imperialism and anti-authoritarianism as we grapple with the complexity of individual cases and the trajectory and the positions of various groups within every case. My fifth observation relates to the growing awareness of political economic alternatives, specifically the awareness of the deleterious effects of 2 decades of neoliberal economic policies. The unavoidable observation is the distinct social polarization people in the region witness between a small set of rising groups, networks, and social strata on the one hand, and the majority of citizens in a number of countries on the other. This applies less to rentier states. Neoliberal policies and effects are often compared with the corruption of state-centered economies. However, publics are now even more aware of the calculus. Neoliberalism, often dubbed as crony capitalism, produced glitter and light and very little by way of distribution or expansive wealth or even opportunities or social safety nets from the perspective of the majority of citizens. By some contrast, I should say, while state-centered economies were just as corrupt and perhaps even more repressive, they did engage to various extents in the provision of social welfare, goods and services that largely benefited large swaths of the population in a far less polarized social structure. I was happy to see Melanie Kamet's data in this regard, which is reassuring. This, of course, does not excuse or condone the formative ills of that period. From a political economic perspective, one path that can be adopted as a start resembles what Yahya Sadowski stated in the 1990s in MERIP. The solution is neither the public or the private sector, but some optimal division of labor between them on a host of factors, based on a host of factors, local and beyond. And this is a paraphrasing. A note about some overarching arguments. I will touch briefly only on one, which is the crisis of authority. Crisis of authority is important, but I am not sure about most of the conversation about this term. Clearly, it could be in effect in some instances, but it is also important to consider that several versions of actual authority are themselves a silent crisis. There is no crisis of authority in a patriarchal household, and neither is there one in repressive authoritarian regimes, and sometimes in capitalist democracies. Thus, there is room for social science and social theory to do more work on terms such as authority and legitimacy in the wake of intersectionality. Not just the faddish intersectionality, but the more grounded version or versions that do not simply throw away all prior intellectual contributions. I will close with a couple of less distressed and methodological and damp observations. We observe just three. Do I have time for a couple? Do I have a minute or two? I do, okay, thank you. We observe a noticeable spike in political and mobilization relearning, despite the enormous and phenomenal efforts at democratist, decentralized, and inclusive aspects of so many of the protests movements. We witnessed a number of positions, processes, and trade-offs by the very same laudable protest movements that either fell short of expected gains or proved destructively counterproductive to the revolution itself. No greater political learning in this regard compares to that of being hyper cautious about calling for international intervention to support the uprising, to support protests, to support revolution. So much so that during the Algerian protests, we observed both vocal and written expressions and signs that outrightly and preemptively reject international intervention and support on the side of the protests. A second quick observation is the breaking of the psychological war of fear, which sounds so cliche, I cannot believe I'm actually saying it in public. This is not a frivolous intangible, however. It is present and functional. We saw it in the expression of protesters against authoritarianism, and we are seeing it today in various forms in countries such as Egypt and even Syria, where many of those who were viewed as supporters of the status quo, not necessarily the regime, but the status quo, are now speaking out against the vastly and ubiquitously deteriorating conditions in Syria and directly addressing the regime in ways that was unthinkable before 2011 in the heart of the capital of Syria or in the heart of the regime-controlled areas in the coast of northwestern coast of Syria. Finally, we observe a rising, and I'm going to stop here. We observe a rising awareness regarding gender inequality and towards the normalized vulnerability of women in public spaces, which is offset against the normalized belligerence of men. And there are other indices on this regard. On the other hand, and the flip side is that the instrumental role of women played in organizing and leading protests, as well as participating and organizing self-governance and handling provisions needed for communities that are cut off from regular state provisions. In differential terms, this was in full bloom throughout, from Syria, Lebanon, and Egypt to Sudan and Algeria and beyond. And clearly, Sudan was a distinguished case in this regard. I do not have a conclusion, but I'm not pessimistic.
Thank you so much, Bassam. That was such an incredible, just incredible insights. And I think the move away from kind of imposing these really at times restrictive, both theoretically and empirically restrictive ways in which we look at the uprisings is really helpful, especially when they're taken out of their temporal context, right? Which is something you so nicely emphasized. The next speaker up is Professor Elizabeth Nugent of Yale University. Elizabeth, Liz, are you ready to go? You don't. There you are. Okay. I will mute myself. Do you need to screen share?
Yes.
Okay.
Can I say something? I just want to say hi to Elizabeth, who we've connected at Georgetown. Hi, Elizabeth.
Yeah. So if I'm wrong, it's Bassam's fault because he taught me everything I know, or many things that I know.
Are you able to screen share?
Let me see. It says host disabled participant screen sharing still.
Can you try it now? Let's see.
Yep, there we go. Okay, are you all able to see? Great.
Cute.
Much better, much better.
That lemon onesie, does it come in adult size?
Oh, okay. So now you're seeing the other. Hold on a second.
We'd rather see that for the
I
record.
know. That's my daughter Juliet, who I'm currently neglecting on a Saturday. Let me just, can you see the slides now? Tantawi and Mubarak. Less of a lemon onesie, I guess. Great. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here on a panel with people that I cite and learn from all the time. Today, I want to talk about repression in Egypt before, during, and after the Arab Spring uprisings. I last year published my first book on repression before the Arab Spring uprisings in Egypt and Tunisia, looking at how the relationships formed, the identities formed during that period were really influential and important for the transition periods, particularly in Egypt and Tunisia, although I talk a little bit about Algeria and Indonesia as well, from different periods. So, that is kind of what I've been working on, and increasingly my interests are driven by events in Egypt. So this project that I'm working on now is much more focused on what has happened since the Arab Spring uprising. So I'm interested to tell you a little bit more about that. So prior to, hold on, I have a, okay, sorry. So prior to 2000, let's start with the definition. The kind of repression that I'm going to be talking about today is a definition that I used in a lot of my work, drawing on Christian Davenport. And here it's very much state behavior, a focus on the physicality, the coercion, which seeks to demobilize actors who challenge regimes' beliefs, institutions, and actions. We could definitely think about things like economic repression. That's not exactly what I'm going to be talking about today. It's much more on focus on arrests, beatings, harassment, targeted assassinations, raid, torture, disappearances, mass killings, and forced exile, really focused here on kind of the corporal integrity of citizens and political opposition. So prior to 2011 in Egypt, I would categorize the Egyptian regime as a targeted repressive environment, where you have groups that are being targeted with repression, put in jail, arrested, raided, sometimes exiled, although that's been a much more recent phenomenon. And that is, in contrast to groups that are being co-opted. In my book, I talk a lot about how in Tunisia, you had a widespread repressive regime, right? Where you have multiple groups being treated the same in the same exile spaces, the same jails, et cetera. So under, 3 consecutive military regimes, we have a targeted repressive environment. Under Nasser, after that initial period of kind of widespread repression, which was very much about consolidating the regime after 1952, you have the Brotherhood, that has the Mihna period. Under Sadat, there's a bit of a switch based on the regime's ideology, focusing on leftists in terms of repression and co-opting the Brotherhood. An anomalous situation arises in 1981, but we can categorize it as a regime that was very much targeting leftists. And then under the Mubarak regime, the Muslim Brotherhood was targeted with repression in these 5-year periods surrounding national elections. For the most part, the repression that happened under the Mubarak regime was reactive. So, either in response to intelligence that something was going to happen or an actual event that occurred. And during, at least the Mubarak period, I don't have as many firm numbers for before, there were about 30,000 political prisoners. And that's important to keep in mind, when I get to the Sisi period. So during the uprisings, there's often this narrative that, of course, the military did defect, at least from the Mubarak regime, maybe was more of a decapitation rather than a true regime change. And so while the military was not firing on protesters, there still was a lot of repression that was happening, quite a bit of which was documented by participants. So during the actual uprisings, there were at least 2 big conflicts between police and protesters, the Battle of the Camel, which happened prior to Mubarak resigning, Port Said football massacre. And then, in the context of the next year, during which there were continued protests, we see police continuing to essentially do the job that they have done in defending the regime, very violently reacting to protests in places like Maspero and the Mohammed Mahmoud battle that occurred in November 2011. Then we get to the transition period. So here I'm really talking about, after Mubarak resigns and before the coup in July 2013. SCAF is in power for that first year. And initially, there was some hope that this was progress. They issued, probably everyone remembers this image of a woman in a blue bra being dragged and beat up by police in Tahrir Square. There were also some terrible things that went on in the square in terms of, police conducting virginity tests for protesters, etc. The SCAF actually issued a public apology acknowledging that they had done this and also that they were sorry for it. So, at the moment it was a big deal that this was even acknowledged. But ultimately, with the gift or the distance of hindsight, the status quo very much prevails. No one was held accountable in any of the very limited number of court cases that were brought against either individuals who were in the coercive institutions or the institutions themselves for what happened during the uprisings. And SCAF really, similar to the way that multiple regimes, both, in Egypt and elsewhere talked about this, repression was seen as being important and justifiable in the name of stability, particularly after the destabilization of the uprisings in the early 2011 period. Then Mohamed Morsi, former or nominally former Muslim Brotherhood member, a member of the FJP, is elected in a free and fair election, becomes president in 2012. This is a period that's really peak high polarization between Islamists and secular opposition, between Islamists and the military and remnants of the old regime. There are a number of clashes that occur between supporters of the president and opponents before the coup. We're not even there yet, during which the police, again, behave as they have been designed to in the way that they've been trained to. They are torturing people that they arrest. And a lot of this gets blamed on the Morsi regime, the Morsi administration, as somehow being different. Although I think we could probably say that it's very consistent with the way that the police have behaved over, decades. And then we get to July 3rd, 2013, where the current president of Egypt, on your screen, you can see him on the left, announces a coup on national television. He has, you can't see it in this picture, but members of the secular opposition are sitting behind him. And he's elected in essentially an authoritarian referendum within the next year. He's recently pushed through constitutional amendments that might let him stay in power through 2030. What happens in the aftermath of the coup, which removes Morsi from power, is a roundup of the Brotherhood. So over 41,000 people are arrested and charged with being connected to the Brotherhood in some way, whether that was voting for them, being a family member, being an actual member. And this occurs between July 2013 and May 2014. So you can see just how much the numbers are really ramping up during this period. Then, of course, there's the Rabaa massacre. Officially, there were 648 deaths. Human Rights Watch reports closer to over 1,000 deaths. Where in the military and the CSF fire on peaceful protesters in the Rabaa Square, protesting against the coup in support of Morsi. By the end of the year, the Muslim Brotherhood is outlawed as a terrorist organization. And this leads to, kind of open season on the Brotherhood in a way that we hadn't seen in quite a while. So since 2013, Bruce Hoffman, who does some really wonderful work on Egypt, has referred to this as kind of a new form of authoritarianism. And I think there's something to be said about whether or not this is a continuation of the way in which the Egyptian regime has repressed, for the last 50, 60 years, or if we're dealing with something new. So since 2013, it's really become a widespread repressive regime where you have not only the Brotherhood was certainly, the first victims of this regime, but it's now just about anyone, including puppets, artists, journalists, secular opposition. It's very proactive. So if you remember before, I was talking about how repression would occur in response to either intelligence or in response to an event. It's very much now anyone who could be a threat at any moment. And again, in comparison to the previous period where we had about 30,000 political prisoners, there's between 60 and 100,000 at this point. The regime has had to construct 19 new prisons to house this population. But at the same time, prisons are still over capacity. With these new 19 prisons, there's still 160% over capacity. And domestic NGOs have been reporting how this overcrowding and stuffing these political prisoners into these spaces has made Egypt's prisons, quote, not fit for humans. It's really deteriorated from some of the cushy experiences that people would describe of being jailed under the Mubarak regime. And beyond this, the regime seems to be, at the moment, maybe bankrupting itself in terms of the new tactics that it's using in trying to go after political opposition in every form, in every space. So domestically, the Egyptian regime, for the most part, had used, prior to 2011, a lot of arrests and imprisonments in military courts. They're still doing that, but they're also using things like travel restrictions, which is a new thing. A data set that I've been collecting for my new book project shows that in the last 6 years, there's been 1,100 people that have been placed either on travel ban or detained from traveling and kind of disappeared into the system. This went from about 1 to 20 per year before 2013 up to 321 in 2014. So this is, exponential change. Disappearances are also somewhat new, or not new, right? I mean, the Egyptian regime has used these tactics before, but it's now becoming a widespread tactic where you have potentially tens of thousands of people who have been detained, are not officially charged with anything, and are somewhere in the system, somewhere in the prison system, somewhere in the judicial system without having access to their lawyers, to their family. And increasingly, we see a lot of transnational repression. So both, repressing people abroad. There's been a huge increase in the number of MOI, Ministry of Interior employees who are now posted at consulates and embassies abroad. They show up at protests, they show up at events that Egyptian activists and exiles are having. The regime is starting to go after the family members of people who have left Egypt under duress. And this is something that was just posted 2 weeks ago on March 25th by the Egyptian embassy in DC, where it's asking Egyptians abroad to register. It's questionable what will be done with that kind of information. So just quickly in the last minute, I think there are a couple of really interesting implications of repression since 2013. So as I mentioned before, is this a permanent shift in repression, or is this, Nasser of the 1950s reconsolidating the regime and then, returning to a more sustainable targeted repression? Only time will tell. The migration aspect is really interesting. Again, there's been exponential increase in Egyptians leaving Egypt, but also those applying for asylum. So we go from about 10 in places like Egypt, for Egyptians in Canada, the US, Germany, and Italy, some of the biggest places that Egyptians have relocated, to hundreds in the span of the last 5 years. I've recently written a paper about the physical and mental health aspect of being exposed to state violence and repression. Egypt right now has a disaster in terms of the use of tramadol and other kinds of medication that people are using to self-medicate. We find that people that were exposed to violence during the revolution are twice as likely to be using these kinds of drugs in the aftermath. Have a really interesting panel survey from the Population Council in Egypt. A positive thing, because I know we all want some hope at the end of this, there's been some really interesting innovation and activism under this very repressive regime. And beyond that, Yusuf El-Shazly is a political scientist who's looked at how people have made revolutionary changes in their own life that sometimes are very difficult for us as scholars to observe, but choices about educating your daughters, changing your profession. There's different ways that people have responded to how repressive this system is right now. And finally, there has been a bit of a shift in terms of the unification of opposition. This draws on the argument I put forward in my first book that widespread repression does create, both bonding identities and relationships between people when they're in these repressive spaces together. So, one hopeful moment might be the increasing cooperation we see among Egyptians outside of the country and inside of the country, talking about some of these issues as human rights issues rather than a brotherhood versus a secular issue. And with that, I will turn it back over to Shamaran.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was incredibly insightful as well. I would love to get your take on the role of the deployment of surveillance technology and, the extent to which Egypt and Egyptian actors are able to kind of use this technology both inside the country and outside the country. And so that's really, really fascinating. Thank you so much. I'll turn it over to our last speaker in this panel and for the day, Francesco Cavatorta. Francesco, go ahead. Do you need to screen share?
No, I do not. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much for allowing me to participate in this incredibly interesting panel. I suppose that as the last speaker, it's incumbent on me to try to offer some sort of positivity to the proceedings, I suppose. So we had 7 highly pessimistic analysis of what has been going on and what is going on. Let me maybe try to slightly buck this trend. I was asked to talk a bit about the Tunisian experience, which is in many ways a contrast to the other cases in the Arab world when it comes to the outcome of the protest from 2011. It is the 10th anniversary of the Arab uprisings. We're always, kind of now in the mood for some sort of assessment of what has gone on, what has been a success, what has been a failure. I kind of would like to make that a bit more problematic. I think it's not easy to kind of come down on one side or the other, say, well, Tunisia has been a success where this other country has been a failure. However, it is, in comparatively speaking, Tunisia has had a degree of success. And what I would like to do is list a few of the successes that Tunisia has experienced, maybe also outline some of the failures that same country have experienced, and then try to broaden it out to what has occurred in other countries too. So that in the end, and maybe I'm just kind of giving away the punchline here, is that we have seen a lot of successes also where there have been failures. Like if globally speaking, in some countries, the revolts have not resulted in democratization, which is usually the measuring stick, by which we measure, in fact, success or failure, then yes, there's been a lot of failures all across the region, but within those failures, there have been considerable successes, and I try to say something about that. And conversely, Tunisia, which is held up to be a huge success, and in many ways it is a huge success, particularly if democratization is, institutional democratization is what we are defining as success, there have been considerable failures too. So let me start with Tunisia. So Tunisia has had a reasonably peaceful and reasonably quick process of transition to democracy. I mean, we've gone from interim governments in the spring of 2011 to the elections for the Constituent Assembly in October 2011. There have been a couple of years of high volatility, but this, as the democratization literature tells us, is to be expected. This volatility resulted in, yes, in confrontation in the streets, in 2 high-profile political assassinations of leftist leaders. We have seen the rise of Salafism in the street and the opposition between Islamist and kind of more secular sectors of society. But overall, by January 2014, maybe also because political actors had looked to Egypt, and now the transition there ended, decided that a political compromise would be satisfactory for everyone. A new constitution was finally signed off on. And then since then, we've had, kind of regular elections. The losing party accepts that it has lost elections, and then the new party comes in, forms a government. The government eventually kind of collapses. Then they form another government. And the democratic life, in a way, democratic institutional life, I think is an incredible success. You know, there's multi-party politics. There are free and fair elections. There is an election commission, overseeing the process. The media environment has been freed, so all sorts of media are now accessible to ordinary citizens. All the restrictions that existed under Ben Ali when it came to the internet have been lifted. There is a high authority that kind of oversees as well the media environment, and there are a number of civil society organizations that have popped up. Civil society, as Van Madam explained earlier, is very lively in Tunisia, and it concerns all sorts of sectors and all sorts of issues. So it's not only one small sector of society that is involved in activism. Activism is pretty much everywhere. In fact, Tunisia, I think, has gone through an incredible number of protests, even over the last few years, over a number of different topics, ranging from social issues to economic ones. So overall, one could say that democracy in Tunisia is working, because it's working much like it is working elsewhere. It looks like, if you want, a typical Southern European country. So it doesn't have, I suppose, the institutional rigidity and the institutional legacy that older democracies have, maybe in the north of Europe. But if you look at everyday Tunisian political life, it doesn't look that much different from, I suppose, Greek or Italian political life. And in many ways, that is a huge success, because they have done so in 10 years, and avoiding, in fact, the conflicts and the civil conflicts that have characterized some of Tunisia's neighbors as well, notably Libya. However, and this is the big however, you can also look at Tunisia as a series of quite significant failures. If one looks at the socioeconomic picture of the country, one has to admit that the uprisings and the subsequent process of democratization have done very little to lift, in fact, most Tunisians out of their socioeconomic despair and disenfranchisement. That is a reality that is recognized by the political system as well. In fact, many would argue that the economy was probably performing better before the uprising than today, 10 years after the uprisings, which is, I suppose, an indictment in of itself, given that large part of the reason why there was an uprising in the first place was due to poor socioeconomic conditions and the growth of inequality. None of that has really been addressed in Tunisia, for reasons that we've already discussed. A combination of infighting at the political level inside the country, but also the overall broader conditions of the global economy, and the ideological as well as political grip that neoliberalism has on ruling elites. So that has been a huge failure. And that failure, in fact, has generated other failures that are now undermining profoundly, in my view, the strength of Tunisian democracy. So there is, for instance, a huge loss in trust in political parties and elected representatives and parliament. There is an increasing desire in some ways for the return of the strong man. That desire is particularly worrying because the cohort that is more favorable to that are the younger cohorts of people who maybe do not necessarily remember what life was like under Ben Ali. There is no enthusiasm for the political process. Turnout is been decreasing ever since the first election in 2011. There is a lot of difficulties for political parties to maintain internal disciplines within parliament, with kind of migrations of elected deputies from one party to the other, the creation of new parties. There's a lot of party defections, there's splits. There's a rise in this kind of also nationalist conservative populism that is quite quite worrying. There is also now, paradoxically, a greater role for the military in political life than there used to be under Bourguiba and Ben Ali. Empowered the military, of course, by the fact that they need to preserve the stability of Tunisia against, I suppose, the regional instability surrounding the country, and therefore the Tunisian military has benefited from funding and grants and collaboration with foreign militaries, which makes it a more important actor, paradoxically, it used to be. Now they have drones. They are building security walls. They are in charge of a lot more security externally, but also internally than they ever used to be. This has also empowered then the actors that had been marginalized within the Ministry of Interior immediately after the revolution. The police unions are particularly strong. There is a much greater acceptance as well on the part of the population for these kind of broad security measures that have been brought in. So, as I was saying, the success should not obscure the failure. If we broaden this out of Tunisia, you can see something similar occurring elsewhere, but maybe in reverse, in the sense that where Tunisia has been successful in generating a genuine democratic life in elected institutions and that are really accountable to ordinary citizens, its neighbor Morocco, for instance, has not seen very much of that. The king remains the central figure in policy making and in effective decision making. What usually he says goes, and what the political parties say, well, goes only if the king agrees that it goes. Otherwise, it doesn't go, as we have seen with his dealings with the PJD over the last few years. I think though that kind of a success in Morocco has been, though, in a way, the mobilization of society on issues that were considered marginal or unimportant, a greater awareness of the possibility of social activism. There is the possibility of, bringing up issues that were not particularly well accepted. There is, there is more participation at the local level in politics and in protest, as we have seen in the Iraq movement, for instance, a few years back. A much more sense of the necessity to create citizenship awareness, that you're not simply a subject, but you're a citizen as well, with all the rights that should come with that. So one would say, well, Morocco's uprising has been in a way a failure, because not much seems to have changed in Morocco over the last 10 years in terms of who is really in charge of the country. But at the social level, stuff has changed quite dramatically. I mean, the protests like the ones in Iraq, in the protests like the one in the Reef, in Iraq, that's a different it's a different type of protest. But the idea is that I think that if we are able to move away from the binary success failure with democracy as the measuring stick, we are able to see societies that are in conflict, that are torn, where there are profound divisions, that have socioeconomic difficulties, but there's also, I suppose, the germs for some sort of renaissance, of social and political renaissance, with a lot of younger people being mobilized, often at the local level, often away from the limelight of the media and of Western researchers. There's a lot of stuff that goes on in Tunisia as well as elsewhere that I think makes me, in a way, a bit more optimistic than the colleagues who preceded me. I don't think I underestimate the scale of the challenges in place, but I think if we have to be fair to the last 10 years of what has been going on, I don't think that there is only conflict, repression, misery, inequality, and violence that we should bear witness to. There's an awful lot of resilience that I think we should also focus on, and I think that might be, as I said, something that allows us to be a bit more optimistic about the future of the region. So I would leave it there because I think, when you're a last speaker, you don't want to go on forever and ever, having people switching off. So, I'll leave it here, and I'm more than happy to answer questions about Tunisia and Morocco, North Africa more generally, if there are any. So thank you very much again for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Francesco. That was also incredibly helpful. And I like the kind of parallel developments that you noted, and almost like an inverse trend happening in Tunisia and Morocco. And that was really insightful. We've got a couple of questions in the chat box, starting with Jenna, who asks, beyond political will, do youth in the MENA region have the organizational capacity, coordination, or political parties needed to actualize their political asks? In areas of increasing state repression, do youth need mass mobilization through organized leadership, or is grassroots organization a stable avenue for change? So I don't know, maybe if Francesco, you want to take that on, given that you've kind of hinted at some of these more localized protest movements that are happening, that I agree with you actually do give me a bit more hope, because they bypass the state and establish entities in many different ways. And then I don't know if anyone else, Stacy, maybe speak to what's happening in Yemen as well in that more localized dimension, or Bassam and Elizabeth.
I will say something very briefly about that, because I think it is important to look at this phenomenon in the short term and in the long term. I think, and it's always the traditional division in within political institutions and politics in general, the difference between kind of what used to be called in the good old days of the communist parties, actionism, which they rejected, which was the kind of daily activism of the youth, in terms of being involved in issues that pressure political parties from the outside, and the difference of actually being inside the political party and doing the institutional job. I think there's a lot of that in part explained, I suppose, the reluctance of a lot of young people to get engaged in political parties. At the same time, though, I think in the short term, it is really important that we notice that this youth mobilization does exist. It's very lively. It's very lively in places like southern Libya, for instance, in places where you necessarily would not expect it. I think it's important because it speaks to a desire of change and a desire to live fully your citizenship in many ways. And I think it's important because in a way it does provide a bit of pressure on political parties and institutional actors. In the long term, though, what I think it is indeed important, that I'm doing my work now on political parties, is to kind of maybe stop demonizing political parties and try to revert back to the functions that they maybe used to have and that they used to fulfill better in the past, of representation and also of collecting diverse interests and diverse policy issues and trying to make them into some sort of coherent program to then fulfill once you're in government. I think we don't have that yet, and I think it's an important point to underline. But I think for the moment, I'm happy to see that the youth is still involved, doing stuff at the civil society level in this sort of actionism. Political parties are not yet the vehicles for them to move to a different phase of the struggle for change, but I think political parties remain crucial. In the long term, there has to be a much better connection, because the sniping at political parties, which happens not only in Tunisia or Morocco, by the way, I think this is a kind of a global phenomenon in many ways. At some stage, given the institutions we have within a given state, political parties are the channel through which we make our demands, I suppose, known, and eventually our policy preference will be implemented only through the political party chain.
Right. So if I can just jump in here and say something about how this played out in Yemen. The uprising had a strong anti-partisan element to it. People rejected the parties that were representing the opposition, and negotiated the terms of the framework for the 2012 to 2014 transitional period. And they had really good reasons to object to it. It was a power grab by existing political parties who were really a gerontocracy. I can understand why youth were alienated. But I also participated in meetings in 2013 with Yemeni youth activists who were trying to decide what kind of posture to adopt at the national dialogue and whether there was like a coherent youth perspective or youth platform. And there wasn't. And I don't see why we would expect there to be, because youth are a variegated category with regional interests, with ideological interests, with gender interests, and women aren't all on the same page either. You know, so that kind of internal diversity is both realistic reflection of who people are and what they want, and also an inhibitor to collective action as a single bloc. Something really interesting that I see happening right now in the context of the war. So first of all, most of the civil actors who I was describing would count as youth. Almost all, just the population structure is such that most of the non-combatant activists I'm describing are under the age of 40 at least, right? And many are much, much younger. So they are remaining super active. They're also facing incredible pressures, militant recruitment for young men, underage marriage for young women. So they're under a lot of pressure, but they're staying really engaged. What's an interesting opportunity here is that the parties have ceased to function as parties because there's a war, right? They exist in name only. To talk about the Islah party right now doesn't make a lot of sense. You can describe Islah aligned militias, right? But not the Islah party as such. They haven't held an internal election since before the uprising, right? Their internal party functions aren't working. This is a moment of opportunity, I think, in some ways for youth who want to form new parties, form new forms of political organization ahead of whatever comes after the war. The problem is that this is the same problem that I was talking about earlier, the international peace brokering framework privileges pre-existing entities, just as it did with the 2011 transition. They're going to go to the people who have capital letters after their name, Islah, or the socialists, or whatever grouping it is. And so I think parties are going to be privileged in the peace brokering process, but they don't exist in the same way now. And that's a real opportunity for youth who are super engaged to start doing what Francesca's described. I think to start planning for a partisan afterlife. Or an after war when they can engage in more conventional politics.
Thank you so much to you both. There's a two-part question, I think, from Guthurai Kooks. The first one is for Francesco. Are there possible strongman figures you see emerging in Tunisia? And then there's a follow-up question also from Guthurai, noting, I'm also curious regarding Tunisia, to what extent democratic leaders or have been able to change the repressive practices of the internal security services and make changes within their entrenched bureaucratic structures. And I don't know if Elizabeth, you want to jump here too, maybe compare Egypt as well, because it seems like it would be a pretty good comparison to make.
In terms of strongman figures, I don't see any yet, although there's talk that maybe the new strongman will actually might be a strong woman. There's a kind of a populist politician who's married to the leader of one of the police unions who seems to be vying for that particular role. So maybe we'll see a strong woman rather than a strong man. But at the moment, there doesn't seem to be the appetite yet for the part of the majority of the population, because I think they've kind of, and this is part of the success, they've got used to be able to speak their mind freely. They've got used to be able to criticize, complain, and even have kind of very strong confrontations with each other as citizens, not only in parliament. So there is a bit of nostalgia, but I'm not sure. I think it maybe can be compared to the nostalgia for communist rule that used to exist in Eastern Europe 10, 15 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall. It never really materialized much until these kind of strong men were, in fact, elected into power, like in Poland and Hungary. Now, maybe Tunisia is kind of destined to go the same way. I hope not. In terms of how did they deal with security sector reform? Well, they didn't really deal with it very much. There was a piece out, I think, a year ago by, I forget the name now, in Middle Eastern Studies outlining, in fact, that despite the all the initiatives taken also by external actors to promote security sector reform, this did not really materialize. In part because I think the police unions, the Ministry of Interior, has always had some sort of independent, well, maybe autonomy rather than independence from the political system the last 10 years, and they have not really given that autonomy up, and civilian oversight has been patchy at best. So the practices have not changed as much as they as probably one would have expected in a democracy. One example that I can provide is that a few years ago, when when Salafism seemed to be, the real challenge to Tunisia, to Tunisia's stability, they resorted to the security services resorted to the same kind of tactics. They went into poorer areas, rounded up a lot of young men, and then put them in jail and kind of left them there for a while, with beatings and torture and so on. So unfortunately, not much seems to have changed in that respect. What there is, though, is and that is part of maybe the success, there is a lot more opposition to the way in which things are done coming from citizens concerned with these kind of issues. So it is very different from what happens in Egypt, and maybe Elizabeth can say something about that, of course.
Yeah, I think Francesco's absolutely right in that security sector reform has essentially not happened really in Tunisia. I mean, it's kind of like, democratization is very difficult. So what do you do first, right? So, Tunisia has been very successful at having free and fair and competitive elections. They're now, trying to tackle some of the economic issues, but security sector reform is costly both economically and politically. There's a great piece by Derek Lutterbeck, I think it's a 2015 piece, where he talks about, it's called Tool of Rule. So it's also like a very kind of fun title about the Tunisian police. And reading that article, over the past year has been really interesting, because I think it challenges this notion of what exactly a democratic police force is supposed to look like. So Francesco referred to this idea of civilian oversight. It's also a centralized system, so you don't have independent police and independent, like municipal police, right? So individual people and then individual stations making kind of arbitrary decisions. And then the third component that he talks about is budgetary oversight and transparency. And, over the past year, as I've been like doing some promotion for my book, I often get asked, does that exist anywhere? And I'm not sure it does, right? I mean, if we think about the decentralization of policing elsewhere, the issues with budgetary lack of transparency, it's just very interesting to think about Tunisia kind of in a global scale. It clearly is doing better than Egypt, but I don't even know where, I don't know what the ideal policing system would be at this point. But I do echo Francesco's idea as well, that there's less tolerance for this stuff. There were protests last year and this year against essentially qualified immunity, in so many words, for Tunisian police officers. You don't quite see that in other authoritarian countries in the region. So there is, I would encourage people to think about it as a global issue, and kind of what is the scale on which we're thinking about Tunisia in terms of how bad or good it is in terms of this.
Thank you so much. One of the things that was striking, Francesco, when you were talking about this authoritarian nostalgia, it's also creeping up in Iraq, actually, and especially amongst youth populations in Iraq who were children and really don't have a recollection at all or experience under Ba'athist rule. And you see these kind of, interesting sentiments pop up in forms of authoritarian nostalgia. The next question is from, let me make sure, Kamil Shahayeb. Despite ample, this is specifically for Elizabeth, despite ample warnings from international development organizations like the World Bank and the IMF and Western governments for the need to implement reforms, engage citizens, loosen repressiveness, forge new equitable social contracts in Egypt, Why do these organizations, these international financial institutions and governments still engage with authoritarian incumbents, giving their amplification of repressiveness and exclusionary politics? So in essence, why do we still support these governments when they go against even domestic laws and norms about, human rights abuses and things like that, in considering both aid, and I think one of the most interesting ones is military arms sales, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it probably depends on the international organization or the government, but I think broadly we can say that Western governments and international organizations are not actually interested in democracy in these countries, right? I mean, stability is kind of the name of the game. Exponential economic growth, keeping strategic points like the Suez Canal open, right? So I think that's like a very cynical perspective, but I think the United States in particular with Egypt, they are interested less in human rights abuses and more in the peace with Israel and the Suez Canal and other strategic interests. And I think, this is not specific to any American administration, right? It's kind of been the same process, whether there's a Republican in power or a Democrat in power. When you've seen opposition groups win in early elections, 2006 in Gaza, 2005 in Egypt, the US pulls back from its democratization promotion, right? I mean, they don't want instability. They really want partners who are going to work with them, and they're willing to turn a blind eye to some of this stuff. And I think with the IMF, I think with international organizations, it's a little bit different, but there's still, a focus on growth and kind of these tangible aspects of democracy, right? Are there elections? Is there economic growth? Are levels of inequality falling? I don't know. Maybe I'm too jaded at this point, but I think the problem is like true democracy is actually quite destabilizing and potentially very costly, again, economically for international organizations.
Yeah, that's so well said. It is costly, and it could potentially, shatter that leverage that a lot of these states have with these authoritarian regimes or, hybrid regimes. The next question is from Mehtab Anaz. This is for Francesco. If we accept the success of Tunisian democratic transition as a fruit of the strategic decisions and actions of actors, how do you think the future of Tunisian democratic process is in the local conjuncture of socioeconomic failure? Because the theory says that even actors and their decisions led to democratization, to the maintenance of democratization needs and economic development. So I guess, are these being met?
This is I think the crucial bit that has been brought up by speakers before me as well. The crucial point of economic development, and I would add that economic growth, economic development needs to be substantially different from the type of economic growth and economic development that Tunisia experienced under Ben Ali, because under Ben Ali, Tunisia grew quite a bit. In fact, leading up to the uprisings, the economy, if I'm not mistaken, was growing at about 5% a year, which is something that I suppose established democracies would be delighted with if they had 5% growth every year over a sustained period of time. Problem was the type of economic development, the who benefited from this kind of economic development, and whether this economic development was actually real and tangible for the majority of citizens, which it wasn't. And this is where maybe I am more pessimistic. I think, given the global circumstances and given where Tunisia has to start from, I do not see the issue of socioeconomic development being dealt with well rapidly, which is what, unfortunately, Tunisia needs, as Professor Mohadam mentioned earlier in the first panel, this consensus about creating a Tunisian social democracy. She's quite right. All the data point in that direction. We did a study with a colleague about the policy preferences of voters and parties and what they had to offer. And there was a significant consensus around this idea of creating some sort of, social democracy with high social spending and a safety net and a free market, of course, next to it. But but this has not happened, and it is unlikely that it will happen without not only. I mean, unfortunately, Tunisian decision makers can do very little about it. They are very dependent on the European Union just north of them. And unless the European Union decides to do something incredibly different and to offer incredibly different terms when it comes to trade or when it comes to aid, it is unlikely that they will have the necessary socioeconomic development to sustain, not to sustain democracy. They will be able to sustain democracy, but the point will be, what kind of democracy will it be? I mean, if it's a democracy only in name, then I don't think Tunisia will revert back to authoritarianism. But if it's a democracy only in name and without real kind of content and attention that is being paid to socioeconomic rights, then yes, then we will have some sort of facade democracy without real engagement on the part of ordinary citizens, who, by the way, in most countries of the Arab world, look at democracy as a combination of political civil rights and socioeconomic rights. This is something that we tend to forget in the West, where we focus overwhelmingly on political and civil rights. But the very definition of democracy for a lot of Arab citizens is about a combination of both, where socioeconomic rights are equally important because they do allow them to have greater political and civil rights. So, I'll end on that.
Thank you so much. The next question is from Sophie Petit. This is for Dr. Yerev. Or any other woman on the peace building process. Do you see any clear avenues to translate women's community peace building work into inclusion and higher level peace processes? Do you think there are opportunities for international peace brokering institutions like the UN envoy to shift their practices to facilitate that in a way, especially because women usually aren't the people holding those powerful positions that are privileged in the UN-led peace process? It's a great question.
Right. I mean, women are not broadly included. And the UN Special Envoy has had 6 years of really sustained feedback on this point. And so I don't have a lot of faith that, and there have also been 3 UN Special Envoys, I should point out, right? It's been a rotating office. I don't have a lot of faith in that coming through the currently instantiated UN peace brokering system. So I think one of the first necessary steps is a new Security Council resolution that more accurately reflects the war that's actually happening and authorizes engagement with a broader set of actors. When I said that 2216 is a constraint on the UN Special Envoy, I meant it. Like, members of that office say that they can't reach out to various CSOs and peace building groups, many of which are led or at least significantly showcase the work of women. I think what really is necessary for greater gender inclusion in the process is a political process first. And this is a kind of controversial claim, right? Just that most peace building focuses on stopping the fighting and then implementing the institutions. And I actually think institutions need to be built/engaged as a way out of the violence. So one thing that this fragmentation means is that there are varying levels of day-to-day security in different parts of Yemen. And it would be possible to essentially what I would call crowdsource a peace agreement from below. It wouldn't be possible to do that, I think, if it's done on a dialogue model that says everybody get together in your different areas and talk about what your community needs. There's been plenty of talking with the UN Special Envoy's office as well. But binding chains of sovereignty that pass from the bottom up. And so that's an expression that comes from the literature on decentralized participatory governance in developing democracies. I just was reading about this in India and Brazil and South Africa this past week. But what it really means is that decisions taken at the local level become incumbent upon those higher up the chain. And so I think the UN could basically be authorized by Yemenis through that kind of bottom-up process. Is that totally unrealistic? Yes, right? It is totally unrealistic. But I think where I see Lender King's appointment and the US Special Envoy's appointment creating a space is that precisely the space to re-envision the kind of Security Council framework and the kind of broad parameters of where the peace negotiations start. That's going to matter for women a lot, and not just for women. And I really do resist the idea that women are a single undifferentiated category. I think we need to allow for the possibility that women meaningfully act on the basis of their regional and other identities, but that's totally compatible with this kind of ground up approach as well.
Thank you so much. There's another question from Kamil Shahayev. And he says, is it sustainable? Given the Egyptian case and cronyism of the SCAF, are there any prospects for a new social contract to emerge as an effective of the repressive authoritarian state in Egypt on the long run? Maybe as an impediment?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting about, I mean, this is this remains an open question, right? Whether or not this is establishing the current moment in Egypt, if this is a continuity from the Mubarak period or establishing a new regime. I mean, right now, the groups that are doing quite well under, the Sisi regime did well under SCAF, they did well under Mubarak for the most part. It's a specific set of pro-regime, pro-military businessmen. There's often a revolving door between, being in the military and then becoming a private business person at some point in your life. So I think, the groups that are doing well, it's not so different from who was doing well in the 1990s under Mubarak. So yeah, that would be my take on that, I think, at this moment. I do think one thing that the Sisi regime is doing that is interesting and a potential place where they might, I don't know, unintentionally destabilize themselves is how much money they're spending on this new capital. They're moving the administrative capital from downtown Cairo out to this kind of gated community. And part of that has been to literally distance itself from a source of, I mean, it's a source of poverty, it's a source of protest, but it is, straining budgets that have already been under strain for, at this point, a decade, in a way that could force them to make different decisions about who's getting state spoils, who's benefiting from the cronyism. It remains to be seen, but it seems to me quite unsustainable to be spending this much money on essentially, building a new capital in the desert, which requires irrigation, it requires electricity, all this kind of stuff that's extremely expensive, and security, right? I mean, this is supposed to be a securitized capital, self-contained. So I think that's one place where there might be, again, it will be regime led, but it's kind of it could be a crack in their armor.
That's fascinating. I had no idea about this new capital. Seems like they're quite isolating themselves. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Does anybody else have any questions either for the first panel or the second panel before we conclude? No? Okay. Thank you so much for joining us. To the panelists, to the participants for taking time out of your Saturday morning and early afternoon. Thank you to Noura for chairing the first panel. Bassam from joining us. You look like you're in a nice sunny place and it looks warm, which is very different from Boston. Wow, I am not jealous at all. Enjoy your space. And thank you so much to the participants and for all the insightful questions and responses from the panelists. We really appreciate it. And yeah, thanks again for being with us. This presentation will be recorded. We will, or it has been recorded, and we will get panelists permission from what Tim has told me before it goes up online. I think there's a few forms or a form that has to be signed of some sort. So we'll be in touch about that.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Shamila, and everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care.